Hey there, glad you made it. Tonight, we're going somewhere different, somewhere deep, twisted, a place where power didn't just corrupt, it devoured. This isn't a history lesson, it's a story, a real one. And if you stick with me, I'll show you how empires rot from the inside quietly, elegantly, like a silk rope tightening around the neck. So, whether you're curled up in bed, on a night drive, or just trying to slow your brain down after a long day, this moment is yours. Before we begin, tell me where you are. What time is it there? It's kind of wild, isn't it? You, me, and people all over the world listening to the same story at the same time. Now, turn off the lights, let a little breeze in, throw on your headphones. In a second, your screen's gonna dim. That's on purpose. Too much blue light messes with your melatonin, and tonight, we want sleep to find you easy. Let the dark wrap around you. Take a breath, and when you're ready, we'll begin. The promise of peace, bought with the blood of Julius Caesar, was a lie. His death was meant to be an end to tyranny, a final chapter to a generation of crisis that had bled the Roman Republic dry. It was supposed to restore the soul of Rome, to hand power back to the men who saw themselves as its rightful guardians. But the future they envisioned, a future of restored glory and senatorial authority, was a mirage. The act that was meant to save the Republic would instead hammer the final nail into its coffin, in the vacuum left by Caesar's fall. A new series of wars erupted, a brutal, 14-year-long struggle for the soul of the dying state. This was a conflict not just of armies, but of titans. Names that would echo through eternity: Octavian, Antony, Lepidus, Brutus, Cassius, Sextus Pompey, Cicero, Cleopatra. They would all step onto this blood-soaked stage. They would forge alliances in the morning and betray them by nightfall, their personal ambitions and private demons becoming the public nightmares of millions. Out of this crucible of chaos, only one man would emerge, standing atop the ruins of the old world, ready to build an empire from its ashes. This is the story of that war, and it is the beginning of the story of a boy named Octavian, the sickly grandnephew of a murdered dictator, who would rise from obscurity to become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The world was about to be remade, shattered and reforged in the image of one man's will. It began with a body. Caesar's corpse, still warm, lay crumpled at the base of a statue of his greatest rival, Pompey the Great. The irony was a gut punch, but no one had time to appreciate it. Chaos was a contagion, spreading from the Curia with terrifying speed. Senators, the supposed pillars of the Republic, scrambled for the exits, their faces etched with a primal fear. They didn't know who was behind the plot, who the next target might be. Was it a purge, a coup? They fled, tripping over their own togas, their dignity abandoned in the frantic stampede for survival. The conspirators, the self-proclaimed liberators, were not far behind. They burst from the Senate House, their hands and daggers slick with Caesar's blood. Some of them, in the frenzied stabbing, had wounded their own comrades. They brandished their crimson weapons, shouting to the heavens, proclaiming the death of a tyrant. But the people of Rome, the ones they claimed to have saved, saw something else entirely. They saw their leaders, men of status and power, screaming and panicking. They saw bloodied daggers and wild eyes. They saw the government of Rome in a state of utter collapse, a spectacle of armed, terrified men running through the streets. It was not liberation they felt, it was terror. In the heart of this pandemonium, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal consul, moved with a predator's instinct. He had been deliberately delayed, kept from entering the Senate chamber where the trap was sprung. That small twist of fate saved his life. He saw the bedlam, understood its implications instantly, and slipped away, shedding the formal attire of his office. He vanished into the crowds, a ghost in a simple disguise, making his way to the safety of his home, where he barricaded the doors, his mind racing, plotting his next move. Some senators, men who lacked the courage to join the plot but possessed the opportunism to exploit it, saw their chance. They snatched daggers, perhaps from fallen guards or their own hidden sheaths, and smeared them with dust and grime, boasting loudly that they, too, had struck a blow for freedom. They merged with the group of liberators, a swelling mob of supposed heroes now bolstered by Decimus Brutus's personal retinue of gladiators, who had been waiting ominously outside the theatre of Pompey. This bizarre procession, a mix of highborn senators and professional killers, marched toward the Forum, the heart of Rome. Their voices rang out, a chorus of manufactured triumph, announcing that a new Brutus, like the legendary founder of the Republic, had once again rid Rome of a king. But the city was not convinced. The public's memory was not so short. They remembered the long, agonizing years of civil war that had preceded Caesar. They remembered the stability, however fragile, that he had brought now. They saw senators, the very men who had plunged the Republic into chaos before, marching with armed gladiators, their faces flushed with a dangerous self-righteous zeal. The people were not won over. They were terrified. Fear was a poison seeping into the very cobblestones of Rome. Caesar's veterans, thousands of them, were in the city. These were hard men, loyal to their slain commander, men who had followed him across Gaul and Africa and Spain. What would they do when they learned their leader, their source of pay and retirement, had been butchered by the very men who now claimed to be saviours? The thought sent a collective shiver down the city's spine. The tension ratcheted up another notch when news spread of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, another of Caesar's loyalists. He had heard of the assassination and acted swiftly. He was just outside the city with a legion of soldiers, stationed on Tiber Island. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for the political dust to settle. He marched his troops to the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, a clear and unambiguous show of force. There, they waited, a silent, disciplined threat looming over the city. Antony soon joined him. The two men, leaders of the Caesarian faction, met under the shadow of impending war. Their soldiers were screaming for vengeance. They wanted to storm the city, to hunt down the assassins and burn their houses to the ground. But Antony and Lepidus were shrewder than that. A street war in Rome would be a disaster, a chaotic bloodbath that could spiral out of their control. No, they would be patient. They would let the conspirators make the next move. They would bide their time and wait for the perfect moment to strike. The liberators, meanwhile, had reached the Capitoline Hill, the ancient citadel of Rome, with their gladiator escort. They blockaded themselves on its sacred slopes, turning a symbol of Roman majesty into a fortress of rebellion. From this high perch, they sent out heralds, their voices echoing across the now emptying forum, proclaiming again and again the death of a tyrant. But the response from the few citizens brave or foolish enough to remain was not the adulation they expected. The people shouted back a single, desperate plea peace. They wanted an end to the violence, an end to the fear. They didn't care about tyrants or liberators. They just wanted their lives back. In the midst of this fragile standoff, a figure stepped forward, hoping to seize the moment. It was Cinna, a praetor appointed by Caesar himself, in a grand, theatrical gesture. He tore off his official robes, the symbol of his authority, and cast them to the ground. He declared that his office, granted by a tyrant, was illegitimate. He praised the conspirators, hoping to win the crowd's favour and align himself with the winning side. But the people remained silent, their faces sullen and unconvinced. His grandstanding had fallen flat. Another player then entered the game, Dolabella, the man Caesar had designated to serve as consul in his absence during the upcoming Parthian campaign. He was young, ambitious, and utterly shameless. He announced that he was assuming the consulship immediately. He then went a step further, claiming he had known about the plot all along and praised the assassins for their courage. The approval of a sitting consul however dubiously claimed, was a significant boost for Brutus and Cassius. They began to negotiate with Dolabella from their stronghold on the Capitoline. They repeated their justifications, their voices strained with the need for validation. They proposed that Sextus Pompey, the surviving son of Caesar's great rival, be recalled from exile, along with others who had been banished by the dictator. It was a calculated move, an attempt to build a broader coalition against the Caesarians. They also sent messengers to Antony and Lepidus, adopting a tone of pragmatic reconciliation. What was done was done. They argued. Now, they must all work together for the good of Rome. It was a hollow gesture and everyone knew it. The Caesarians were still thirsty for blood, but they were also pragmatists. They were nervous. Decimus Brutus, one of the leading assassins, was not just a murderer. He was the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, a position that gave him command of a significant army dangerously close to Rome. They couldn't afford to make an enemy of him, not yet, reluctantly. They agreed to negotiate. Antony, still the legitimate consul for the year, took charge. He summoned the Senate to convene. The meeting was a tense, surreal affair. The chamber was filled with senators, but the most important figures were conspicuously absent. Brutus and Cassius, the masterminds of the assassination, refused to attend. Despite Antony and Lepidus personally guaranteeing their safety, they didn't trust them, and for good reason. One man who did show up was Cinna, the praetor who had so dramatically renounced his office just days before. Now, he swaggered into the Senate wearing the very same Praetorian robes he had declared illegal, a flagrant act of breathtaking hypocrisy. The public, who had gathered outside, were incensed. Their fear and uncertainty curdled into a white-hot rage. As Cinna left the meeting, the mob descended upon him. They swarmed him, their shouts of hypocrite and traitor filling the air. He was beaten, kicked, and nearly torn limb from limb before Lepidus's soldiers intervened, saving him from the brink of death and escorting him back to his house. The incident was a stark reminder of the city's volatile mood. Inside the Senate, the debate was just as fractured. 3 factions emerged. One group vehemently denounced the assassins as traitors and murderers. A larger faction, however, praised them as heroes of the Republic, and a third, perhaps the most pragmatic, simply wanted peace, pleading for a middle ground that would avoid further bloodshed. The first proposal was put to the floor, a formal vote to declare Caesar a tyrant. If it passed, all his laws, all his appointments, all his acts would be nullified. The Republic would be reset, wiped clean of his influence. It was a radical idea, and for a moment, it seemed possible before the vote could be taken. However, Antony stood up, his voice, calm and measured, cut through the clamour. He pointed out a simple, devastating fact. Caesar, in his capacity as dictator, had appointed magistrates and officials for the next 5 years. Many of the men sitting in that very chamber owed their current and future positions to Caesar. If Caesar's laws were declared illegal, Antony explained, then all those appointments would be void. The room fell silent. The implications were staggering. Dozens of careers, years of ambition, would be wiped out in an instant. Dolabella, who was far too young to have been legally elected consul, and whose entire claim to the office rested on Caesar's appointment, immediately backpedaled, his face a mask of feigned horror. He declared his shock and disgust at the very idea of honouring Caesar's murderers, his support for the liberators, so boldly declared just days before, had evaporated. Antony wasn't finished. He then played his trump card. He reminded the Senate of the thousands of Caesarian veterans camped just outside the city and scattered throughout Italy. These men, he warned, would not take kindly to having the laws that guaranteed their retirement land and pensions suddenly repealed. Revoking Caesar's acts would not just be a political manoeuvre, It would be an open invitation to revolt from some of the most battle-hardened soldiers the world had ever seen. The threat hung heavy in the air, a promise of total, anarchic warfare. Finally, Cicero, the old statesman, the master orator, took the stage. He advocated for moderation, for a path away from the abyss. Vengeance, he argued, would only beget more violence. Their duty was not to the dead, but to the living, to the future of Rome. His solution was a masterstroke of political compromise, simple and brutally effective. All of Caesar's acts as dictator would be ratified, preserving the appointments and the veterans' benefits. In return, the conspirators would be granted a full amnesty. Their lives would be spared. It was a way forward. Antony, seeing the genius of the compromise and the opportunity it presented, agreed, but with one crucial condition. Caesar, he insisted, must be given a public funeral, and his last will and testament must be read aloud to the people of Rome. All parties, exhausted by the tension and desperate to avoid open war, agreed. A deal had been struck, a fragile peace settled over the city, following the tense truce in the Senate. The liberators addressed the Romans from the Capitoline. They called themselves by that name liberators, a title they bestowed upon themselves. They claimed Caesar had stolen the Republic's freedom, that he had committed a grave sacrilege by jailing a tribune. The irony was a stench in the air, thick and unavoidable. The very senators who now stood among them, their new allies, had just voted to uphold every single one of Caesar's appointments and decrees. They had been given the chance to tear down the tyrant's legacy, and they had refused, their self-interest outweighing their supposed principles. And while Caesar had indeed imprisoned a tribune of the plebs, a serious religious and political offence, these self-proclaimed saviours had murdered a sitting dictator, a man who also held the sacred office of Pontifex Maximus. Their crime was a sacrilege on an entirely different scale, a wound cut into the very soul of Rome's sacred laws. Brutus and Cassius, trying to win over the still sceptical crowd, promised to grant land to Caesar's veterans. It was a hollow gesture, as Antony had made brutally clear in the Senate. They had no other choice, appeasing the thousands of armed, loyal soldiers camped just outside the city was not a matter of policy, but of survival. Nevertheless, the crowd was momentarily calmed. The two men, for all their hypocrisy, seemed to be seeking a fragile peace, not another war. The city held its breath, with the official pardon made public. Cassius, Brutus, and the rest of the conspirators finally agreed to descend from their fortress on the Capitoline. But their paranoia ran deep. They would only come down after Antony and Lepidus, the two leading Caesarians, sent their own sons up the hill as hostages. It was a medieval gesture in a world of supposed laws, a clear sign that no one trusted anyone. The city watched as the assassins, now pardoned murderers, walked back into the heart of a city that was not sure whether to cheer them or kill them. And then the will was read, as Antony had demanded. Caesar's final testament was unsealed and read aloud before the assembled masses in the forum. The contents landed like a series of hammer blows. First, Caesar gave his private gardens, his lush, manicured estates on the far bank of the Tiber, to the people of Rome. They were to be a public park, a space for leisure and beauty for every citizen. Forever. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. This was not the act of a selfish tyrant. Next, the will decreed a gift of 75 drachmae to every single citizen living in Rome. It was a fortune. For a common labourer, it was nearly 2 months' wages. For the urban poor, it was a lifeline, a gift of almost unimaginable generosity. The murmuring grew louder, tinged with shock and a growing sense of gratitude. This was the man they called a tyrant, but the true bombshell, the one that would shatter the political landscape forever, was the naming of the heir. Who would inherit Caesar's immense fortune, his vast network of clients, and, most importantly, his name? It was not a famous general. It was not a powerful senator. It was not Mark Antony, his loyal right hand. The primary heir was the grandson of his sister, Julia, a 19-year-old boy named Gaius Octavius, a name almost no one in the crowd had ever heard. Octavian. His life to that point had been a study in obscurity. He had made his first public appearance giving the eulogy for his grandmother. He had begged Caesar to let him join the African campaign, but his mother, Attia, had forbidden it. He had finally been allowed to join the campaign in Spain, but had been too sick to participate in any meaningful way, as his destiny was being declared in the heart of Rome. Octavian was in Illyria, undergoing military training with the 6 legions Caesar had handpicked for his Great Eastern campaign. The planned invasion of Parthia. He was a young man learning to be a soldier, expecting a life as a junior officer in his great-uncle's shadow, with no idea that he had just inherited the world. But there was one final, cruel, and brilliant twist in the will. A secondary heir was named. The person who would inherit everything should Octavian die before Caesar. That man was Decimus Brutus, one of the leading assassins, a man who had called Caesar friend, who had lured him to the Senate that day, was named in his will as a cherished beneficiary. The news struck the crowd like a physical assault, a carefully constructed narrative of the liberators, their story of righteous tyrannicide, crumbled to dust. They were not heroes. They were treacherous, ungrateful friends who had murdered their benefactor. The man they had butchered had loved them. The mood in the forum, which had been a mix of confusion and relief, now began to turn. It curdled into a slow, simmering rage. The stage was set. Caesar's body, shrouded for burial, was carried out. A collective groan of grief rose from the crowd, a single, mournful sound from thousands of throats, and into this cauldron of raw, volatile emotion. Mark Antony stepped forward to deliver the speech of his life. He did not begin with anger. He began with law. He calmly, methodically, read all the laws passed by Caesar that the Senate had just voted to uphold, giving particular weight to those that directly benefited the people. He then recited the endless list of honours the Senate had bestowed upon Caesar, protector of the country, father of the country, imperator. He emphasised the sacredness of Caesar's person, the oath that every senator, including the assassins, had sworn to protect him. His voice began to crack. He seemed to choke on his own words. He broke down, weeping openly, his body racked with sobs, a perfect performance of uncontrollable grief. Then, in a moment of pure, devastating theatre, he took Caesar's toga, the one he had been wearing when he was struck down, stiff with his own dried blood, and lifted it high on the point of a spear for all to see. He pointed to the rips and tears, the 23 holes that told the story of the betrayal more powerfully than any words could. The crowd, which had been simmering, was now at a rolling boil, but Antony was not done. He had saved his masterstroke for last. He unveiled a lifelike wax replica of Caesar's body, stripped bare, meticulously crafted to display every single one of the 23 stab wounds in gruesome detail. The sight shattered the last vestiges of civility. The carefully constructed piece exploded. The liberators, seeing the mob turn on them with murderous intent, fled the forum for their lives. The crowd erupted. It was no longer a gathering of mourners. It was an organism of pure rage, a beast with 1,000 heads, driven by a singular, primal need for vengeance. They rampaged through the streets. They stormed the Senate house where the murder had taken place. They tore apart the benches, the tables, the records of the Republic, and built a pyre inside the sacred building, burning it to the ground. They hunted the liberators. Their names now a curse shouted in the streets. Most of the assassins had either already fled Rome or were now barricaded in their fortified mansions, surrounded by armed guards. In the chaos, the mob's fury became indiscriminate. A poor plebeian poet named Helvius Cinna had the misfortune of sharing a name with one of the conspirators. Lucius Cornelius Cinna. He was dragged from his home. His pleas that he was the wrong man were ignored. The mob, in a frenzy of mistaken identity, literally tore him to pieces in the street, in their grief-stricken madness. The mob seized Caesar's body from the official procession. They carried it to the Capitoline Hill, intending to cremate him there, among the temples of the gods, an honour reserved for deities. But the horrified priests of the temple barred their way, protecting the sacred ground from this pagan outburst, thwarted. The crowd carried Caesar's body back down into the forum. They tore apart the wooden stalls of the merchants, the benches of the law courts, anything that would burn. They piled it high into a massive makeshift pyre in the very heart of the city, and there they placed the body of their fallen leader and set it ablaze, as the flames roared into the night sky. The people of Rome threw their own dedications onto the fire. Soldiers unbuckled their swords and threw them into the inferno. Musicians tossed their lyres and pipes. Women tore off their jewellery, their fine clothes, and offered them to the flames. It was a city purging itself of its grief and its rage, a final, fiery, and deeply personal farewell to the man who had been their champion and their dictator. With a single speech, Antony had done what armies could not. He had turned the people of Rome into his personal weapon. He had transformed the liberators from heroes into fugitives overnight. Brutus and Cassius were trapped as praetors. Their legal authority was confined to the city walls, but the city itself now belonged to Antony. He was, for now, the undisputed master of Rome in the immediate aftermath. The ever-fickle Senate blamed Antony for the riots, but he moved quickly to win them over. A populist agitator named Amatius, who claimed to be a grandson of the great Gaius Marius, and therefore a relative of Caesar, had been a leading figure in the riots. In a calculated display of ruthless authority, Antony had him arrested and executed without a trial. This decisive, brutal act won him the grudging support of the Senate, which valued order above all else, but it cost him the support of the common people. The plebeians protested in the forum, outraged at the summary execution of one of their own. Antony's response was swift and merciless. He dispersed the crowd with soldiers and had the ringleaders of the protest executed as well, in less than a month. Antony had performed a stunning political pivot. He had alienated the plebs who had been his greatest weapon, and aligned himself firmly with the senatorial elite he had so recently terrorized. To cement this new alliance, he formally abolished the office of dictator for all time. He even suggested that Sextus Pompey be recalled from exile and named commander of the seas. The Senate, desperate to believe that Antony was a true servant of the Republic, eagerly accepted. For a brief moment, even the great Cicero was won over, but the mask soon slipped. The temptation of absolute power was too much for Antony to resist. He began to abuse his position with an audacity that stunned even his allies. He treated Caesar's vast fortune, which he was meant to be holding in trust for the heirs, as his own personal bank account. He fabricated legislation, claiming to have discovered notes and decrees written by Caesar that conveniently furthered his own agenda. He lavished gifts on foreign kings and entire cities, buying their loyalty. He appointed his own supporters to the Senate, packing it with his cronies, and he amassed a huge personal bodyguard, a private army of 6,000 battle-hardened Caesarian veterans. He was becoming a new Caesar, but without the subtlety or the charm. Lepidus, the other leading Caesarian, was quickly sidelined. Antony arranged a marriage between his daughter and Lepidus's son, and saw to it that Lepidus was appointed Pontifex Maximus, a position of great prestige but little real power. This alarming consolidation of power did not go unnoticed. Brutus and Cassius, watching from their country estates, grew more and more wary. The Senate, their last hope, was now falling under Antony's spell. They began to plan for war in earnest, sending secret messages to their allies across the provinces, urging them to ready their legions and raise funds. The whispers of conflict were starting again. In Rome, Antony's power was nearly absolute, but a few senators still resisted him, and their opposition encouraged Dolabella, the other consul, to act as a check on Antony's power whenever possible. Antony, ever the master manipulator, saw Dolabella's ambition not as a threat, but as a tool. He encouraged the young man to demand the command of Syria and Caesar's Parthian campaign. When the Senate balked, Antony helped Dolabella bypass them and take the proposal to the public assembly, where it was forced through, with Dolabella placated with a massive command. Antony then made his own, seemingly modest request the governorship of Macedonia, a province which had been assigned to Brutus. The exhausted Senate relented. He was building his power base, piece by piece, isolating his enemies and rewarding his friends. The Republic was being dismantled before their very eyes, far away. Octavian had landed in Italy. The boy who had inherited a legend was about to step onto the stage. He was armed with a great name and the promise of a great fortune, but in the brutal reality of Rome, he was nothing. All the real power, and all the actual money, was in the hands of Mark Antony. The future of Rome would be decided by the clash between these two men. Far away in Illyria, Octavian, the boy who was now an heir, weighed his options. The news from Rome was a chaotic torrent of conflicting reports. His officers, men who had served his great-uncle, urged him to be bold. They saw the legions he was training, loyal and battle-hardened, as a tool ready to be used. They spoke of vengeance, of marching on Rome and seizing what was rightfully his. But his family, his mother Attia and his stepfather Philippus, pleaded with him from afar. Their letters were filled with terror. They begged him to return to Rome as a private citizen, to claim his wealth quietly, and then disappear into a life of obscurity and, most importantly, safety. To them. The name Caesar was not a key to power. It was a death sentence. Octavian knew he could not decide from a distance. He had to see the terrain for himself. He left the army and sailed across the Adriatic, a young man on the razor's edge of history, as he landed in Italy. More accurate information found him. Filling in the gaps, he learned the full, brutal details of the assassination. He learned of the compromise in the Senate, of Antony's strange dance with the liberators, and he learned the full contents of Caesar's will. The weight of his inheritance, and the danger that came with it, settled upon him. Many in his retinue, old friends of his family, still urged caution. They begged him to renounce the adoption, to shed the name that had brought his great-uncle to ruin. But something shifted when his ship docked in the port of Brundisium. The city was a major hub for Caesar's veterans, men returning from campaigns or waiting for new assignments. When they learned who had arrived, they flocked to the harbour. Huge crowds gathered, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and awe. These were the men who had conquered Gaul, who had crushed Pompey. They did not see a sickly, unproven 19-year-old. They saw the living embodiment of their slain commander. They did not greet him as Octavius. They greeted him as Caesar in that moment, surrounded by the fierce, unquestioning loyalty of his father's soldiers. Octavian made his choice. He would not be the quiet, retiring heir his mother wished for. He would be the son his new followers demanded. He formally and publicly accepted the adoption. He was no longer Gaius Octavius. He was Gaius Julius Caesar. The name change was an act of defiance, a declaration of intent, and it acted like a magnet. News spread like wildfire. More soldiers, more veterans, more Caesarian sympathizers flocked to his side. With them came more news from Rome. Whispers of Antony's power grabs, of Dolabella's ambition, of the Senate's weakness. With an ever-growing entourage, a private army of loyalists, the new. Young Caesar began his slow, deliberate march toward Rome. He knew that in the city. He was still a political novice. He held no office. He had no official power. The man who had it all was Mark Antony. Antony held the consulship, Antony held the city, and most importantly, Antony held Caesar's vast fortune. To survive, Octavian needed money. He needed it to pay the 75 drachmae legacy to every citizen in Rome, a promise that was now his to fulfill. He needed it to reward the veterans flocking to his banner. He needed it to buy allies in the snake pit of the Senate. His first meeting with Antony would set the tone for the next decade of Roman history. It was a confrontation of epic proportions, a clash of youth and experience, of simmering resentment and arrogant power. Octavian began with a veneer of courtesy. Thanking Antony for ensuring Caesar received a proper funeral, it was a polite but pointed opening. Then, he went on the attack. He criticised Antony for his weakness, for failing to hunt down the liberators when the mob was on his side. He accused him of giving away too much to the Senate, of placating the very men who had murdered their leader. Finally, he came to the point. He demanded the money. He demanded the gold Caesar had amassed for his Parthian war, the funds he needed to pay the people their inheritance. He even asked for a personal loan from Antony's own purse, promising to repay it by selling his inherited estates. Antony was gobsmacked. He was Mark Antony, hero of a dozen campaigns, consul of Rome, master of the city, and this boy, this upstart with no power, no leverage, no right to even be in the room, was not just questioning him, but making demands. His reply was a masterpiece of condescension. He refused. He lectured Octavian on the realities of power, on the sanctity of the Roman constitution. The Senate, he said, was the government of Rome, and Caesar, he made brutally clear, had not left Octavian the Roman government in his will. Neither of them, he claimed with a straight face, had the right to overrule it. As for the money, Antony laughed. Caesar's fortune, he explained, was a complex web of assets, tied up in legal disputes. Properties were being claimed by men returning from exile. Assets needed to be liquidated. The process would take time. It was all lies. Of course, Antony had already spent a significant portion of Caesar's cash, and was deliberately using the legal system to block Octavian's access to the rest. He made his position clear once the lawyers were done. Once the claims were settled, Octavian would get whatever scraps were left. Octavian left the meeting in a cold, silent fury. The lines had been drawn. Antony immediately weaponized the state against his young rival. A flood of lawsuits was unleashed against Octavian, challenging his inheritance from every angle. Men pardoned by the Senate claimed Caesar had seized their property unjustly. Antony himself, his brother Gaius, and his creature Dolabella presided over the courts, ensuring Octavian lost every case. He was being bled dry, forced to sell off his properties at a fraction of their value just to pay the legal fees and settlements. The assault was relentless, until two other, minor heirs named in Caesar's will, Pedius and Pinarius, protested. They too were losing their inheritance and appealed to Antony, grudgingly. Antony allowed them to take their share, but continued to block Octavian's, Pedius and Pinarius, loyal to Caesar's memory, immediately took their money and secretly funneled it to Octavian. The next battle was fought not with swords, but with public spectacle. Antony's brothers were hosting the games of Apollo in the name of the absent praetors, Brutus and Cassius. It was a transparent attempt to rehabilitate the image of the assassins, to win them public support and create a powerful bloc in the Senate indebted to Antony. Octavian saw the move and countered with breathtaking audacity. He sold everything he had left, took the money from his allies, and added it to what little he had. And with this, he finally paid Caesar's legacy to the people, because he had fought so hard for it, because he had been so publicly denied it by Antony. The gift was no longer seen as coming from a dead dictator. It was seen as a gift from Octavian himself. His popularity soared at the games. when Antony's paid heralds called for the return of Brutus and Cassius, the crowd, now fiercely loyal to Octavian, erupted in anger. They stormed the arena, their roars of disapproval drowning out the heralds, shutting down the games until the calls for the assassins were stopped. It was a stunning public relations victory for Octavian. When Brutus and Cassius heard the news, they were furious. Their last hope of a popular return to Rome was gone. They made a new plan. They would go to their provinces and raise armies. The men who claimed to have killed Caesar to save the Republic now abandoned it completely, leaving it to be torn apart by the two men who claimed to be his heirs. But one man stayed, Cicero. The old orator had watched Antony's rise with growing alarm. He saw another tyrant in the making, despite the immense personal danger. He made his choice. He threw his considerable weight and influence behind the young, unproven Octavian. It was only 6 months since the Ides of March. The city was a tinderbox. The relationship between Octavian and Antony was at a breaking point. Across the sea, the liberators were gathering their forces in Sicily. Sextus Pompey was building a pirate kingdom. The Roman world was once again sliding into civil war. By the summer of 44 BC, Antony's grip on Rome was tightening, but it was a grip built on a shaky foundation. The people were suspicious. The Senate was wary. He needed an army loyal only to him. Then, a rumour surfaced, a whisper of disaster from the north. A horde of Getae, it was said, had poured across the border into Macedonia. Antony went before the Senate, his face a mask of solemn gravity. He painted a picture of burning villages and barbarian fury. He requested, for the good of the Republic, that the Parthian legions, Caesar's legions, be put under his command to defend the province. The Senate, reluctant but unwilling to risk a barbarian invasion, agreed. Soon after, new reports came in. The Getae had vanished. Some said they were never there at all, but Antony refused to relinquish command. He had his army. He used it to make new demands. He wanted his brother to govern Macedonia. He wanted Cisalpine Gaul for himself. The Senate, remembering the career of another governor of Gaul, refused. Antony, blocked, turned to Octavian. He forged a temporary, cynical alliance. Octavian would deliver the votes in the public assembly. In return, Antony promised future support. Octavian, who hated Antony but hated Caesar's assassins more, agreed. The law passed. Antony was now the legal governor of Cisalpine Gaul. The Senate, in a last act of defiance, sent messages to the current governor, Decimus Brutus, urging him to hold his ground. Then, the alliance of convenience between Antony and Octavian shattered. A position for tribune of the plebs opened up. Octavian, the popular favourite, wanted it. He asked Antony to repay the favour. Antony refused, claiming Octavian was too young. Then he used his consular power to annul the election when Octavian won anyway. It was a public humiliation, a declaration of war. Octavian, seething, unleashed his agents across Italy. They were to find the veterans, to whisper in their ears, to remind them of their loyalty to Caesar, and to promise them riches if they followed Caesar's son. While Cicero's speeches hammered Antony in the Senate, Octavian's secret network was building him an army. Antony, hearing of the unrest, rushed to Brundisium where his legions were stationed. He found them sullen and mutinous. His offer of a small bonus was met with derisive laughter. Enraged, he had the ringleaders decimated, a brutal act of punishment that temporarily restored order. He sent his legions marching north, but it was too late. 2 of his best legions, the Martian and the Fourth, men who had followed Caesar to glory, defected. They declared their loyalty to Octavian. Antony's authority was hemorrhaging. He now had a full-blown rebellion on his hands. As 44 BC drew to a close, the pieces were in motion for a new war. Antony, with what was left of his army, marched into Cisalpine Gaul to take the province from Decimus Brutus by force. Decimus, one of Caesar's killers, fortified himself in the city of Mutina, preparing for a siege, and Octavian, the young heir, the rogue player, was marching north with his own private army, an army of veterans loyal only to him and the magic of his adopted name. The war for Caesar's legacy was about to begin. As the year 44 BC bled into 43, a cold winter settled over Italy. Around the city of Mutina, two Roman armies faced each other in a grim standoff. Inside the walls, Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins, held out with a dwindling force, his men growing hungrier and more desperate with each passing day. Outside, Mark Antony's veteran legions maintained their suffocating siege, their campfires a ring of fire in the winter darkness. In Rome, two new consuls came to power, Hirtius and Pansa. Both were moderates, men who had served loyally under Caesar but who harboured a deep suspicion of Antony's naked ambition. Their convictions were stiffened by the relentless pressure of one man, Cicero. The old orator was now at the peak of his influence, the de facto leader of the Senate. He hammered Antony day after day with his fiery speeches, the Philippics, painting him as a drunken tyrant, a monster who must be destroyed for the good of the Republic. Cicero moved to have Antony declared an enemy of the state. There was some resistance. Lucius Piso, Caesar's father-in-law, a man respected for his attempts to broker peace in the last war, argued for moderation, for a trial rather than a summary declaration of war. The Senate, in a final gesture of caution, attempted to negotiate. They sent an embassy to Antony's camp, offering him the governorship of Macedonia if he would just give up his claim on Cisalpine Gaul. Antony, confident in the strength of his army and the legality of the assembly's vote that had granted him the province, contemptuously rejected their offer. His refusal was the political ammunition Cicero needed. With the Senate's last peaceful overture scorned, Cicero's hardline faction won the day. Antony was officially declared an enemy of the state. So was his colleague Dolabella, who was now rampaging through the province of Asia. The Senate was now at war, but to fight a war, they needed an army, and their most powerful available force was the private army of the young Octavian. In a masterful series of political manoeuvres, Cicero legalized the illegal. He had the Senate grant Octavian imperium, the official right to command troops, retrospectively making his private army a legitimate force of the Roman state. The young man was formally instructed to assist the consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, in the war against Antony to complete his grand strategy. Cicero had the Senate confirm Brutus and Cassius as the rightful governors of Macedonia and Syria, and ordered all Roman officials in the east to lend them support. It was a stunning reversal of fortune. Cicero had, in a few short weeks, consolidated the power of the senatorial faction. He had an army in Italy, led by two loyal consuls and the newly empowered Octavian, and he had secured the entire eastern half of the empire under the command of the liberators. The liberators themselves wasted no time. Brutus marched into Macedonia, which he had already seized, and solidified his control, capturing Antony's brother Gaius in the process. Cassius, in the east, was a whirlwind of activity. His reputation as the hero of Cari was legendary, and the governors of the eastern provinces, now backed by a senatorial decree, flocked to his side. He quickly amassed a colossal army of 12 legions. He marched on Syria, where Dolabella had murdered Trebonius and taken control. Cassius cornered him in the city of Laodicea. The siege was short. Dolabella, seeing no hope of escape, had one of his own soldiers kill him, with the east firmly in their grip. Brutus and Cassius were now the masters of a vast and wealthy territory, a new republican empire rising to challenge the triumvirs. But the immediate threat was in Italy, at Mutina. Hirtius and Octavian had joined forces. They were cautious, however. They knew the quality of Antony's veterans and were reluctant to risk a pitched battle. They skirmished, They probed. They put pressure on Antony's siege lines, but mostly they waited for Pansa to arrive with his newly levied legions. While they waited, Cicero effectively ruled Rome, levying heavy taxes to fund the war and hunting down Antony's supporters. He pushed one of them, a man named Ventidius, too far. Ventidius, a tough former mule driver who had risen through the ranks under Caesar, rebelled. He raised 3 legions of his own from disgruntled veterans and tried to march to Antony's aid. Finding his path north blocked by Hirtius and Octavian, he diverted his force into the region of Picenum, waiting for an opportunity in late March. That opportunity seemed to vanish. Pansa, at the head of 4 newly raised legions of raw recruits, was marching north to link up with his fellow consul. Antony knew that if their forces combined, he would be hopelessly outnumbered. His only chance was to strike first, to destroy Pansa's Green Army before it could unite with the veteran forces of Hirtius and Octavian. He devised a plan of brutal simplicity. He would lay an ambush, taking 2 of his best legions, the 2nd and 35th, along with his elite Praetorian cohorts and a large cavalry force. Antony slipped past the consular camps near Mutina. He marched down the Via Aemilia, the great road to the north, and concealed his force in the woods and hills bordering a stretch of marshland near a place called Forum Gallorum. He also sent his brother Lucius to conduct noisy, harassing attacks on Octavian's camp, a diversion to keep them pinned down and unaware of the real threat developing to their south. It was a good plan, but Hirtius and Octavian were not fools. They knew Pansa and his recruits were vulnerable. They had dispatched their own elite force to escort him the Martian legion, commanded by one of Caesar's assassins, and 2 cohorts of Octavian's own bodyguard. As Pansa's column entered the narrow causeway through the marsh, they were set upon by Antony's cavalry. The attacks were designed to sow confusion, as expected. The Martian legion and Octavian's bodyguard surged forward to drive them off, advancing out of the marsh and onto the open ground beyond. It was there that Antony's main force fell upon them. The battle was a thing of pure horror. It was a silent battle. There were no war cries. These were Caesar's veterans fighting Caesar's veterans. They were men who had been comrades. They saw each other as traitors. The only sounds were the sickening crunch of metal on bone and shield, the grunts of men straining in mortal combat, the gasps of the dying. The Martian legion's left wing began to crumble under the ferocious assault. Its right wing, however, pushed forward, driving back Antony's 35th. But as they advanced, Antony's cavalry swung around their flank, surrounding them. Pansa, fighting in the front rank, went down, a javelin in his side, in the centre. Octavian's bodyguard was annihilated, fighting to the last man. The Martian legion, battered and broken, began a fighting withdrawal back into the marsh, their retreat hampered by the panicked levies they had been sent to protect. Antony had won a savage victory, triumphant. He began to march his exhausted men back to his camp at Mutina, but as they marched, they were themselves ambushed. Hirtius had come, with the fresh 4th Legion. He slammed into Antony's weary troops. The victors of the morning became the vanquished of the afternoon. Antony's force was shattered, losing almost half its men and its precious eagle standards. He was forced into a humiliating retreat back to his own siege lines. In Rome, they celebrated the victory, but Antony was not yet broken. A few days later, on the 21st of April, Octavian and Hirtius launched a full-scale assault on Antony's camp. Determined to break the siege of Mutina for good, they concentrated their attack on a known weak point in the fortifications. Antony, reluctant to be drawn into a major battle, was forced to commit 2 legions to hold them off, as Octavian's legions slowly gained the upper hand in a grinding, brutal fight. Hirtius personally led a charge into Antony's camp itself. At the same time, Decimus Brutus sallied from the city walls, attacking the siege lines from the rear. The battle raged on 3 fronts. Octavian's men finally broke their opponents and rushed to support Hirtius, but in the swirling chaos of the fight inside the camp, Hirtius, the consul of Rome, was killed. The circumstances were, and remain, deeply suspicious. The historian Appian says Octavian fought heroically to recover his body. The historian Suetonius suggests Octavian had him killed, with Hirtius dead, and another of the leading assassins, Aquila, also killed in the fighting. The battle lost its momentum. Antony, his army battered and his position untenable, finally abandoned the siege that night. He slipped away with the remainder of his forces, beginning a long and desperate retreat west. The war, it seemed, was over. But then, Pansa, the other consul, also died, succumbing to the wound he had received at Forum Gallorum. Again, the whispers started. Was it just the wound, or had his doctors, on Octavian's orders, applied poison to the dressings? 2 consuls, the 2 men who outranked Octavian, were dead. The Senate, led by Cicero, hailed the victory as a triumph for the Republic. They gave the credit to the dead consuls and, incredibly, to Decimus Brutus, the man who had done little more than cower behind his walls. Octavian, the man who had raised an army, who had fought and bled and won the decisive battles, was given a minor mention, a pat on the head. He was then ordered to turn over his legions to Decimus Brutus, to the murderer of his adoptive father. The betrayal was absolute. The young man who had been the Senate's loyal, if ambitious, pawn, finally understood the game, and he decided he would no longer be a pawn. He refused the order. He knew his men would never follow an assassin of Caesar. When Decimus ordered him to pursue Antony's retreating army, he again refused, and calmly watched as Antony's forces slipped away to safety. It was a moment of profound, cold-blooded rebellion. The Senate had created a monster to destroy another, and now that monster was turning on its masters. Octavian sent out his messengers, not to Rome, but to the west, to the camps of the other Caesarian commanders, to Lepidus and to Antony. His message was simple: the Senate has betrayed us all. The followers of Caesar must unite. Antony, the fugitive, reached the camp of Lepidus in Gaul. After tense negotiations, Lepidus, who commanded a massive army, threw his lot in with him. Soon, the other Caesarian governors, Pollio and Plancus, followed suit. Antony's shattered army was reborn. He now stood at the head of a colossal force of 17 legions, the most powerful army in the Western world. The political landscape had been redrawn in an instant. In the east, Brutus and Cassius, with the Senate's backing, were supreme. In the west, the Caesarian faction, once fractured, was now a monolithic force under the joint command of Antony and Lepidus. And in Italy, caught between these 2 giants, was Octavian. He had been used and cast aside by the Senate. He was hated by the liberators, and he was still deeply distrusted by Antony. But he had 8 loyal legions. He had the loyalty of the veterans, and he had the most powerful weapon of all, the name of Caesar. The Republic was a corpse, and the vultures were gathering, with both consuls dead. Rome was a ship without a rudder, adrift in a sea of chaos. The Senate, which had tried to play the factions against each other, now found itself dangerously exposed, and Octavian, the young man they had empowered and then betrayed, was camped just a few days' march away, at the head of 8 battle-hardened legions. He was furious, and he was ambitious. He saw the power vacuum and decided to fill it himself. In July, he sent an embassy to Rome. It was not composed of silver-tongued diplomats, but of grizzled centurions, the hardened sinew of his army. They strode into the Senate house, their armour clanking on the marble floors, a stark violation of the sacred space. Their demand was blunt, stripped of all political nicety. They demanded the consulship for their general, Octavian. and they demanded that the decree declaring Mark Antony a public enemy be rescinded. One of the centurions, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his gladius, spoke for them all. He looked at the assembled senators, the so-called rulers of the world, and gave them an ultimatum. "If you do not grant the consulship to Caesar," he said, his voice low and menacing, "this will..." The Senate, in a final, futile act of defiance, refused. Octavian was only 20 years old. He was a boy. He was legally too young to hold the highest office in the Republic. His delegation shot back, citing a dozen precedents, other men who had been granted the office while underage in times of crisis. Still, the Senate refused. They could not bring themselves to bow to such a blatant threat. When the news of their refusal reached Octavian's camp, his soldiers erupted in rage. This was not about political idealism. It was about their pay, their land, their futures. Their general's power was their own security. They demanded he march on Rome and take what the Senate would not give. Octavian, with a show of reluctant acceptance, agreed to their demands. He led his 8 legions south. He came to a small river that marked the boundary of Italy proper, a river whose name was already a synonym for treason and civil war. He crossed the Rubicon. History was repeating itself with a chilling symmetry. Another Caesar was marching on Rome at the head of a rebel army. The Senate fell into a blind panic. They sent new messengers, racing to intercept Octavian, promising him everything he had asked for: full command of the armies, the right to the consulship, a complete and utter capitulation. But almost as soon as the messengers had left, a wave of shame and defiance washed over the Senate. 2 legions, sent from Africa to aid in the war against Antony, had just docked at Ostia and were marching to the city. There was also the garrison legion left behind by Panzer. 3 legions. It was a long shot, but it was a chance. Cicero, his brief period of moderation shattered, rallied his colleagues. They would resist. They revoked their offer of surrender. The 3 legions were deployed to defend the city. The walls were fortified. The brief flicker of defiance was all for nothing. Octavian marched his army to the very outskirts of Rome and made camp on the field of Mars, his forces a silent, disciplined, and overwhelming threat. The sight was enough to break the Senate's nerve. 2 of their 3 legions, seeing the vast army arrayed against them and hearing the magic of the name Caesar, lost heart and immediately defected to Octavian. The Senate's brave stand had lasted less than a day, in a final, desperate move. Some senators started a rumour that 2 of Octavian's own legions had defected back to them. A few of them, grasping at this phantom hope, even tried to raise new troops. The rumour was, of course, a lie, most likely started by Octavian himself as a clever ruse to identify his most die-hard opponents. He took note of their names. They would all be on his list. The elections were held. It was a foregone conclusion. Octavian was elected consul. His co-consul was his relative and ally, Quintus Pedius, the man who had helped fund him in his early struggles. The boy had won. Now came the retribution, as his first act. Octavian established courts to try the assassins of Caesar. The trials were a legal farce. Men who had not even been in Rome on the Ides of March were charged and convicted in absentia. The verdicts were unanimous. The proceedings presided over by Octavian himself, one praetor, a man of conscience, voted for acquittal. He was later proscribed. Another was accused of plotting against the new consul and sent on a ship into exile in Africa. The ship and its crew were never seen again. It was a chilling preview of the reign to come. Octavian would not make Caesar's mistake. He would show no mercy. While he was securing his grip on Rome, he was also playing a larger game. He knew he could not defeat the massive armies of Brutus and Cassius in the east alone. He needed allies. He needed the other Caesarian legions. He had the Senate officially rescind the decree that had declared Antony an enemy of the state. He sent letters of friendship to Antony and Lepidus, who were commanding a combined force of 17 legions in Gaul. They in turn recognised the new reality. With Octavian in control of Rome and Italy, it was better to have him as a partner than an enemy. They responded in kind, the three great Caesarian warlords, so recently at odds, were now moving towards an alliance. Their first act as an unofficial triumvirate was to eliminate the last remaining Republican commander in the west. They marched their combined forces against Decimus Brutus. Decimus, seeing the end was near, found his legions deserting him in droves. He tried to flee to Macedonia in disguise, but he was captured by a Gallic chieftain loyal to Antony, on Antony's orders. The man who had led Caesar to his death was summarily beheaded, with the Italian peninsula now firmly under their control. The three new masters of the Roman world met to formalise their partnership and divide the spoils. In late October of 43 BC, they gathered on a small, purpose-built island in the middle of a river near Bononia. Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. Each man was backed by his finest legions, drawn up on the opposing riverbanks, a silent, menacing audience to the historic negotiation. On that island, they buried the Roman Republic. It was agreed. Octavian would resign the consulship he had just seized. In its place, a new office would be created by law, a committee of 3 with a mandate to reconstitute the state. They would hold near absolute power for a term of 5 years. They could make laws, appoint magistrates, and judge cases without appeal. Their word was law. They were 3 kings, masquerading as republican officials. Then they carved up the western provinces. Antony, as the senior partner with the most legions, took the richest prize all of Gaul, the vast territory that Caesar had conquered. Lepidus received all of Hispania and a slice of southern Gaul, lands rich with silver mines and men. Octavian, the junior partner, the upstart, was given the leftovers, Africa, Sardinia, and Sicily. These were territories either contested by Sextus Pompey's powerful fleet or known hotbeds of anti-Caesarian sentiment. It was a deliberate move to hamstring him, to keep him occupied with difficult, resource-draining wars while they consolidated their power. Octavian accepted his portion without complaint, his face a mask of youthful compliance, hiding the cold fury within. He would play the long game. Their military plan was simple. Lepidus would stay in Italy with a garrison force. Antony and Octavian would combine their main armies, cross into Greece, and destroy Brutus and Cassius once and for all. And then they turned to the most terrible item on their agenda: how to pay for this massive war, and how to eliminate their enemies in Rome for good. They decided to revive a monstrous tool from the Republic's darkest chapter, a tool of political terror made infamous by the dictator Sulla: proscriptions. They would draw up lists of their enemies. Any man whose name was on that list was condemned to death without trial. His property was forfeit to the state. A bounty would be placed on his head, turning every Roman citizen into a potential assassin. It was a plan born of cold, ruthless necessity. They needed the wealth of the rich to pay their legions, and they needed to eliminate any potential opposition before they marched east. In this, they were of a single, bloody mind. Caesar had been merciful, and he had been murdered for it. They would not repeat his mistake. The 3 of them sat and wrote up the lists. They condemned their political rivals. They condemned men who had wronged them. They condemned men simply because they were wealthy in this grim transaction. Even blood ties meant nothing. Antony, it was said, agreed to add his own uncle to the list in exchange for Lepidus's brother being condemned. It was, as Plutarch would later write, a barter of murder for murder, each man sacrificing one of his own to secure the death of an enemy he hated more. The great Cicero, who had been Octavian's mentor and champion, was one of the first names on Antony's list. Later, Octavian's apologists would claim he fought for 2 days to save Cicero, that he was a reluctant participant in the slaughter, but the most reliable sources from the period offer no such excuse. They paint a picture of three men, equally culpable, trading lives with a chilling lack of emotion. On that island, the young Octavian, the boy who had once seemed so different from the warlords who surrounded him, proved he was just as ruthless, just as willing to wade through blood to achieve his goals. In 3 days, they had plotted the overthrow of the Roman state and planned the murder of 300 senators and 2,000 wealthy equestrians. The Second Triumvirate, an institution founded on terror, was now a reality. They marched on Rome. A hand-picked death squad was sent ahead to deal with 17 high-priority targets before they could flee. Cicero, warned by his friends, went into hiding. Others were not so lucky. The city was gripped by a new wave of panic. The triumvirs entered the city on 3 successive days, each at the head of a legion, a brazen display of military force that trampled on centuries of tradition. A puppet tribune proposed the law that officially created their new office, with soldiers filling the forum. It passed without a single dissenting vote. That night, the full lists were posted, whiteboards covered in names, a public declaration of a new reign of terror. The hunt had begun. The Republic was dead. Its ghost would haunt the world for centuries, but the thing itself, the messy, chaotic, and vibrant system of shared power, had been murdered on that small island. Its death warrant signed by the 3 men who claimed to be its saviours. The triumvirs began their march on Rome. They did not wait to enter the city to begin their reign of terror. A death squad was sent ahead, tasked with hunting down 17 men, the most prominent of their immediate political enemies. The list was a closely guarded secret, a fact that plunged the entire city into a state of deep paranoia. No one knew who was on it. Any man with wealth or influence felt the cold hand of fear on his shoulder. Cicero, the great orator, was at the top of the list, warned by his vast network of friends and clients. He managed to elude the first wave of hunters, becoming a fugitive in his own country. A tribune of the plebs named Salvius was not so lucky. He was hosting a lavish banquet in his home, surrounded by friends, when the soldiers burst in. The laughter died in their throats. The guests were frozen in shock and terror. The soldiers ordered them to remain in their seats, to not move a muscle. Then, as the guests watched in stunned silence, they walked to the head of the table, seized Salvius, and beheaded him right there. His headless corpse slumped forward onto the table, his blood pooling amongst the wine cups and platters of food. It was a message, a brutal piece of political theatre designed to announce the new rules of the game. There would be no trials, there would be no mercy. The acting consul, Pedius, a decent man caught in an impossible situation, tried to quell the rising panic. He obtained the list of the 17 names and publicised it, hoping to reassure the public that the hunt was limited, that the rest of them were safe. The effort killed him. He died the following day, reportedly from sheer exhaustion and political fatigue. It's hard not to think he was murdered for his act of compassion, for interfering with the triumvir's campaign of fear. Cicero's luck had run out. He had attempted to flee Italy by sea, but a vicious storm had forced his ship back to the coast. He was old, frail, and sick with a weariness that went deeper than the body. He was tired of running. His loyal slaves carried him in a litter to his villa near Formiae. The local people, who loved him, had tried to protect him, lying to the death squads, sending them on false trails. But in the end, he was betrayed by a local shoemaker, a man named Philologus, who owed his education to Cicero himself. The ultimate treachery. The man sent to kill him was a centurion named Herennius. Cicero had once defended Herennius in court and saved him from conviction. The centurion now approached the litter, his sword drawn. Cicero's slaves wanted to fight, to defend their master to the last, but Cicero forbade it. He ordered them to set the litter down. He looked his executioner in the eye. He did not beg, he did not plead. The 63-year-old orator, the voice of the Republic, simply commented on his own unkempt beard and offered his neck, Herennius. His debt of gratitude repaid with murder, killed him with a single sword stroke, Cicero's head, and the hands that had written the fiery Philippics against Antony were severed from his body. They were taken to Rome, there, on Antony's direct order. They were nailed to the rostra, the public speaking platform in the Forum. It was the very spot where Cicero had delivered his greatest speeches, where his voice had once held the city spellbound. Now, his rotting head and hands served as a grotesque warning to any who might dare to speak out against the new masters of Rome. The voice of the Republic had been silenced, its dismembered parts put on display like a hunter's trophy. The triumvirs then made their grand entrance into the city, over 3 successive days. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Each entered Rome at the head of a full legion, their armed soldiers marching through the sacred city limits in a brazen, contemptuous violation of centuries of law and tradition. A puppet tribune immediately proposed the law that would legally create their office, with thousands of soldiers patrolling the Forum. The law was passed without a single dissenting voice. The second triumvirate was now the official, legal government of Rome. That night, the full prescription lists were posted. On white wooden boards erected throughout the Forum, hundreds of names were written out for all to see. The city stared in horror. The purge was not limited to 17 men. It was a bloodbath. A reward was offered 100,000 sesterces for the head of a proscribed man, a fortune that could make a poor man rich overnight. A lesser reward was offered for information on a fugitive's whereabouts. Any person caught sheltering one of the condemned would have their own name added to the list. The gates of the city were sealed by soldiers. No one could escape. The great hunt began. Appian's account of the days that followed is a descent into a nightmare. Rome became a city of ghosts and hunters. Men of wealth and status hid in the most wretched places imaginable, in sewers, in wells, in the narrow flues of chimneys, in cold baking ovens. They were found, dragged out, and butchered in the streets by bounty hunters eager for their reward. One senator was discovered hiding in a steaming pile of dung. These soldiers, unwilling to reach into the filth, simply thrust their spears into the heap until he was driven out. Wounded and befouled, they beheaded him on the spot. Brothers were found hiding together and were executed with a single sword swing, their bodies falling as one. The terror consumed everyone. Even children were not safe. Orphans who had been left large fortunes by their parents were added to the list. One young boy was at his school when the hunters burst in. His tutor, a brave man, tried to shield the child with his own body. They were both cut down without mercy, night after night. New names appeared on the lists. No one could feel safe. The city was gripped by a suffocating paranoia. Wives betrayed husbands. Sons, eager for their inheritance, informed on their fathers. Siblings sold each other out for a handful of silver. Old scores were settled under the cover of the chaos. Men murdered their personal enemies and claimed they had found them on the list. Many of the condemned simply gave up. Some walked out of their homes and handed themselves over to the first patrol they saw, hoping to spare their families from reprisals. Others simply waited in their homes for the inevitable knock on the door. Some chose their own end, leaping from rooftops or throwing themselves from bridges into the Tiber, their bodies washing up on the banks for days. An 80-year-old senator named Statius, finding his name on the list, performed a final act of public defiance. He opened the doors of his grand house and invited the public to take whatever they wanted. After the mob had stripped it bare, he set the building on fire and perished in the flames. Wives killed themselves over the corpses of their husbands. Entire family lines were extinguished. But even in this abyss of human cruelty, there were flickers of incredible courage. A senator named Capito made his last stand in the narrow doorway of his house, cutting down several of his attackers before he was overwhelmed. Sons faked their fathers' funerals, building empty pyres and mourning publicly, then smuggled them out of the city in the dead of night. One carried his frail, elderly father on his shoulders to safety. One slave, hearing that soldiers were coming for his master, a proscribed senator, calmly swapped clothes with him. He lay down in his master's bed and waited. The soldiers burst in, killed the man they thought was the senator, and left. The real master, dressed in the rough tunic of a slave, stood in the shadows and watched his own murder, a silent witness to an act of loyalty beyond comprehension. The few who dared to stand up to the triumvirs were often women. Antony's own mother, the formidable Julia, was outraged to find that Antony had proscribed her brother, Lucius. She marched into Antony's headquarters and confronted her son, declaring that she would personally protect her brother if Antony wanted him dead. She screamed. He would have to kill her first. Faced with his mother's iron will, Antony, the master of Rome, backed down. He removed his uncle's name from the list. Later, when the triumvirs, still desperate for funds, levied a heavy tax on the 1,400 wealthiest women of Rome, it was another woman who led the resistance. Hortensia, the daughter of a famous orator, rallied the women and marched on the forum. She stood before the three most powerful men in the world and spoke with a courage that shamed every man in the Senate. In times of foreign war, she declared, Roman women would gladly give their gold to the state, but they would not contribute a single coin to a civil war. They would not help them murder each other. Her protest was so powerful that the triumvirs were forced to reduce the tax. The proscriptions had turned Rome into a charnel house and filled the triumvirs' coffers with confiscated property. But they struggled to turn that property into cash. The richest buyers were either dead or too terrified to bid at the auctions, afraid that displaying their wealth would earn them a spot on the next list. Many of the proscribed managed to escape the city. They fled to the two remaining bastions of opposition. They made their way to Sicily, where Sextus Pompey was building his naval power, or they undertook the long journey east, to the provinces controlled by Brutus and Cassius. Sextus even offered his own rewards to anyone who helped a fugitive reach him. His forces swelled with experienced soldiers and influential senators, all of them now bound to his cause by a burning hatred for the triumvirs, with their enemies in Italy either dead or scattered. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus were in absolute control, but their bloody purge had created thousands of new, desperate enemies. And in the east, the two men who had started it all were preparing for the final battle. While Rome was drowning in blood, Brutus and Cassius had been methodically consolidating their power. Brutus had secured Macedonia and the loyalty of its legions in an act of cold necessity. He had executed Antony's brother, Gaius, eliminating a potential source of mutiny. Cassius, with his vast army, had secured Syria and the surrounding provinces. They met in the city of Smyrna to plot their grand strategy. Brutus, the idealist, wanted to march immediately on Italy. He argued for a swift, decisive confrontation. Cassius, the seasoned pragmatist, urged caution. He understood that war was won with money and logistics as much as with valour. Their enemies had powerful naval allies in Rhodes and Lycia before they could think of invading Greece. They had to secure their rear. They had to neutralise those fleets and, more importantly, seize their treasuries. Cassius's view prevailed. He marched on Rhodes, the great naval power, after a brief but sharp naval battle. He besieged the city and forced its surrender. He executed its leaders and emptied its treasury. Brutus, meanwhile, marched against the Lycians. He laid siege to their capital, Xanthus. The siege was a brutal, ugly affair. The Xanthians, in a final act of defiance, chose mass suicide over surrender. They killed their families and themselves, leaving Brutus the master of a city of ghosts. He was said to have been horrified by the outcome, but the brutal logic of war could not be denied. With these two campaigns, the liberators had crushed all potential naval threats in the east. They now had a secure base of operations and a massive war chest, enough to pay their 20 legions for years to come. They were no longer just a band of assassins. They were the rulers of the eastern half of the Roman world, with an army and a treasury to rival that of the triumvirs. The stage was now set for the final. Apocalyptic confrontation. The two halves of the empire, one forged in a bloody purge, the other in a methodical conquest, were about to collide, with their war chest full and their armies consolidated. The liberators turned their gaze west. A fleet under the command of Admiral Mercus, which had been sent to intercept a non-existent threat from Cleopatra, was repurposed. He sailed to the coast of Italy and established a blockade around the port of Brundisium, hoping to choke off the triumvir's ability to move men and supplies across the Adriatic. It was a sound strategy. But Antony and Octavian were not conventional men. They were gamblers, and they were desperate. They began a series of audacious, high-risk sea crossings. They packed their legions onto transport ships without military escort, relying on speed, favourable winds, and sheer luck to slip past the blockade. The voyages were fraught with tension, every soldier on deck scanning the horizon for the sight of Mercus's warships. But the gamble paid off. Soon, Antony and Octavian had managed to ferry 11 legions, the core of their army, into Greece, leaving Lepidus behind to keep a tenuous hold on Rome. Mercus, outmanoeuvred and furious, could do little more than try to harass their now lengthening supply lines. The board was now set. The triumvirs sent 8 of their legions ahead, under the command of 2 legates, Decidius and Norbanus. Their orders were to march into Thrace and seize the key mountain passes, the gateways into Greece from the east, before Brutus and Cassius could reach them. Meanwhile, the liberators crossed the Hellespont from Asia Minor into Greece, their massive army a river of men and steel pouring into the European mainland. The local Thracian kingdom was ruled by 2 brothers, a perfect microcosm of the entire war. One brother, Ruscupolis, honoured his alliance with Brutus and joined the liberators with 3,000 cavalry. The other brother, Rascus, sided with the triumvirs, leading his own 3,000 horsemen to join their forces, brother against brother, Roman against Roman. The armies that finally converged in northern Greece were some of the largest the world had ever seen. The historian Appian puts the numbers at nearly 100,000 men on each side. The triumvirs had 19 legions and 13,000 cavalry. The liberators, also with 19 legions, boasted a massive superiority in cavalry, with 20,000 allied horsemen, including thousands of deadly horse archers from Parthia and Arabia. Modern historians are sceptical, suggesting numbers closer to 60,000 a side were more logistically feasible, but even at this more modest estimate, the combined force represented 250,000 of the most dangerous men on the planet, all gathered in one place to slaughter one another. The greatest and most terrible irony was in the banners they carried. Many of the legions on both sides had once served under one commander, Julius Caesar, the very legions he had led to glory. The men who had been his instrument of conquest were now poised to annihilate each other to determine the fate of his legacy. It was a repeat of the war between Caesar and Pompey, but on an even grander scale. The Caesarians, now led by Antony and Octavian, had their army in Greece, but their supply line across the Adriatic was fragile. Threatened by the enemy's superior navy, the new Pompeians, led by Brutus and Cassius, had a secure rear, a massive war chest, and the strategic advantage of the defensive. They could afford to wait. They could starve their opponents into submission before beginning their march. Cassius and Brutus made sure of their men's loyalty. They distributed a massive bonus, paying each soldier from the vast treasuries they had seized in the east. Cassius then addressed the army. He defended the assassination of Caesar, not as a murder, but as an act of liberation against a man who had put himself above the law. He decried the triumvirs as tyrants and butchers, men who had murdered their own families in their lust for power, and he spoke directly to the veterans of Caesar's legions. "You were not his soldiers then," he proclaimed. his voice ringing across the assembled ranks. "But our countries. The pay you received was not Caesar's, but the Republic's. Today, you're not the soldiers of Brutus or of Cassius. You're the soldiers of Rome." It was a powerful speech, and it worked. With their army's morale high, they marched into Greece. Their first obstacle was the army of Norbanus and Decidius. Dug in and holding the mountain passes, a direct assault would be costly, perhaps impossible. Cassius, a brilliant strategist, devised a feint. He sent a single legion on a fleet to sail around their position, making sure that Norbanus's scouts saw them. The legion landed and made a great show of setting up multiple camps, creating the illusion of a much larger flanking force. Norbanus, fearing he was about to be trapped between two armies, abandoned his position and marched to join Decidius, concentrating his forces at the main pass. The feint was a stunning success. The liberators immediately marched through the now undefended pass, but the main pass was now more heavily fortified than ever. A direct attack was out of the question. Again, fortune favoured them. Their Thracian ally, Rascupolis, knew the mountains like the back of his hand. He told them of a secret track, a path barely wide enough for goats, that bypassed the main pass. It would be a grueling 4-day march, but it was their only option. But Rascus, the brother allied to the triumvirs, also knew of the path. He spotted their flanking manoeuvre and sent a warning to Norbanus. Realizing his formidable defensive position was now worthless, that the enemy was about to appear behind him, was forced into a panicked retreat in the dead of night. He abandoned the pass and withdrew his entire army. The liberators had outmaneuvered their opponents at every turn, seizing the strategic high ground without spilling a drop of blood. Sometime in September of 40 BC, they made their camp near the town of Philippi. The position was a fortress. They occupied 2 hills, connected by a continuous wall. To their front was a wide plain. To their north, a dense forest. To their rear, impassable mountains and gorges. To their south, a vast marsh stretched to the sea, where their navy, based at the nearby port of Neapolis, could keep them supplied indefinitely. It was a perfect defensive position. Antony, learning of their location, was undeterred, eager for a fight. He merged his forces with those of the retreating Norbanus and marched on Philippi. Octavian, recovering from a bout of illness, arrived soon after, carried on a litter. Antony made an audacious move. He camped his army on the open plain, less than 2 miles from the liberators' fortified hills. It was a reckless, aggressive statement. His position was vulnerable, but he immediately set his men to work, digging their own trenches, building their own ramparts, for days. The 2 colossal armies watched each other across the plain, the tension building, broken only by minor cavalry skirmishes. Antony was impatient. He marched his army out each day, offering battle, but Cassius and Brutus refused to take the bait. They had the high ground. They had the secure supply line. All they had to do was wait. Antony's army would starve long before theirs did. Antony knew he had to force a battle, and soon. He devised a plan of great cunning and immense labour. He sent a detachment of his men into the great marsh to their south, working in secret, mostly at night. They began to construct a causeway, a hidden road through the swamp that would allow them to move troops around the liberators' flank and threaten their connection to the sea. Cassius spotted the work and moved to counter it. He began extending his own fortifications south, building a transverse wall through the marsh to cut off Antony's causeway. With a large part of Cassius's army now occupied with this frantic construction race in the swamp, Antony seized his moment. On the 3rd of October, he launched his attack. He hurled his legions at Cassius's camp. It was an incredibly daring assault, a charge uphill into a fortified position under a hail of missile fire. But with many of Cassius's men caught out in the open, working on the new wall, Antony's veterans punched through the defences. They stormed into Cassius's camp, tide of red shields and flashing swords. At the same time, on the other side of the battlefield, something extraordinary happened. Brutus's legions, watching the assault on their comrades' camp, charged. It was a spontaneous, unordered attack. It's unclear if their officers lost control or if the men themselves, filled with a furious energy, simply decided to act. They surged across the plain and crashed into Octavian's legions, which were drawn up in front of their own camp. They tore through the 4th Legion on Octavian's flank and then rolled up the rest of the line. A general rout began. Octavian's men were cut down as they fled, and Brutus's legions streamed into their camp, looting and killing. Octavian himself was nowhere to be found. He would later claim he had been warned in a dream and had escaped just before the attack. A more believable account from Pliny suggests he was carried by his servants into the marshes, where he hid in the mud until the fighting was over. Whatever the case, his camp was overrun, his legions shattered, their eagles captured. Brutus's men had won a spectacular victory, but Antony had been just as successful. He had repulsed the attacks from the men working in the marsh and had completely overrun Cassius's camp. Forcing Cassius and a small band of followers to retreat to a nearby hill, Antony's men looted the camp and then, their bloodlust sated, retreated back to their own lines in a strange, dusty twilight. The two victorious forces, Brutus's legions from the north and Antony's from the south, marched back across the plain at the same time, but the distance between them was great, and the air was thick with the dust of 10,000 fighting men. Each army assumed the other was a friendly force returning from the battle. They passed each other without engaging. It was only when they returned to their respective starting points that they understood the bizarre truth. The first battle of Philippi had ended in a bloody, chaotic draw. Each side's right wing had crushed the opposing left. The liberators had lost around 8,000 men. The triumvirs had lost 16,000, twice as many. But the liberators had suffered a loss that could not be measured in numbers. Cassius, standing on the high ground, seeing his camp overrun, assumed all was lost. He saw a group of cavalry riding hard towards his position, in the dust and confusion. He could not make out their banners. He assumed they were the enemy, coming to capture him. They were, in fact, Brutus's men, coming to bring him the joyful news of their own victory on the other flank. But Cassius did not know this. Unwilling to suffer the humiliation of being taken prisoner, he turned to his loyal freedman, Pindrus, and ordered the man to kill him with his death. The liberators lost their most experienced commander, their best strategic mind. Total command of the army now passed to Brutus. Later, when Brutus found his friend's body, he wept. He called Cassius the last of the Romans. He had him buried in secret, worried that a public funeral would crush the morale of his already shaken army. The same day, news reached Antony that a fleet transporting 2 more of his legions and vital supplies across the Adriatic had been intercepted and completely destroyed by the Liberator navy. His supply situation was now critical. He needed to force another battle, and quickly. But the death of Cassius had changed everything. The scales had tipped. Antony knew his situation was desperate. The news that his reinforcement fleet, carrying 2 fresh legions and a mountain of supplies, had been utterly destroyed in the Adriatic was a devastating blow. His army, camped on the open plain, was now effectively cut off. Winter was approaching. Food was running low. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it now, day after day. He marched his army out, offering battle, hoping to tempt Brutus down from his fortified hills. But Brutus, now in sole command of the Liberator army, held firm. He was shaken by the death of Cassius, but he remembered his friend's strategy. The strategy was sound. All he had to do was wait, with a secure supply line from the sea. He could simply let Antony's army starve, with his force now weakened from the brutal fighting of the first battle. Brutus tried to consolidate his position, making his defensive perimeter shorter and stronger. In doing so, he abandoned a small, seemingly insignificant hill to the south that Cassius had previously garrisoned. It was a minor adjustment, a tactical decision that seemed prudent at the time. It would prove to be a fatal mistake. Antony saw the opening immediately. He was a brilliant battlefield tactician with an almost animal instinct for weakness. He seized upon this small advantage with lightning speed. He sent 4 legions to take and fortify the abandoned hill. Over the next few weeks, a tense, grinding war of engineering began. More and more of Antony's legions were funneled to this new southern position. They began constructing a long line of defences, a wall that crept steadily, day by day, parallel to the coast. It was a classic Caesarian tactic, a favourite of Brutus's murdered mentor. Seize a small advantage, and then use it as a foothold to slowly, inexorably, manoeuvre into a position where you can threaten the enemy's supply line. Antony was building a noose, and he was slowly tightening it around Brutus's neck. Brutus was forced to react, to counter Antony's creeping wall. He had to build his own line of fortifications opposite it. In doing so, he was forced to stretch his own defensive line further and further to the south. The very strategy he had adopted to make his position stronger, shortening his lines, was now being undone. His army was being stretched thin, its defensive integrity compromised. A crisis of confidence began to brew in the Liberator camp. Brutus's officers, many of them seasoned veterans, grew more and more frustrated with his cautious strategy. They saw their lines being overextended. They saw their supply line, their greatest advantage, being threatened. They had lost faith in his command ability. Brutus was a philosopher, a statesman, an idealist. He was not a general like Cassius. They began to demand that he take action, that he stop digging and start fighting. The pressure was immense. The arguments in his command tent grew more heated with each passing day. His lieutenants, men who had once looked to him as the saviour of the Republic, now saw him as a ditherer, a man whose caution was going to get them all killed. Brutus, a man more comfortable with books than with battlefields, finally, reluctantly, gave in. His words to his officers were heavy with a sense of tragic foreboding. "You have chosen to fight," he told them. "You have forced me to battle when I would conquer otherwise." He drew his army out of their fortifications and prepared for battle. He arranged his legions in the classic Roman formation of 3 lines. He placed himself on the right wing, the traditional position of command, and he weighted that wing, placing more of his best legions on his right than in his centre or on his left. He was hoping to repeat his stunning success from the first battle, to crush Antony's flank and then roll up the rest of their army. To compensate, the legions on his left were forced to spread out, their line dangerously thin, to avoid being surrounded. Antony and Octavian eagerly drew out their own forces. They also formed up in a triple axis, with Antony commanding the left wing opposite Brutus and Octavian on the right, opposite Brutus's weakened flank. Their legions were distributed evenly along the line. There was little manoeuvring, little grand strategy. It was to be a battle of pure, brutal attrition. The 2 armies, both filled with veterans, crashed into one another. The fighting was a bloody, grinding, hand-to-hand slog. It was a meat grinder, a battle fought yard by yard, man by man, on his wing. Brutus was slowly, agonizingly, winning. His elite legions, fighting with a desperate fury, were gradually pushing Antony's men back, but on the other side of the battlefield, a disaster was unfolding. Octavian's men, outnumbering their opponents, were also winning. They pressed their advantage against Brutus's thin, overstretched left flank. Step by bloody step, they forced it to retreat. The entire battle now rested on a knife's edge. It was a race. Whichever flank broke first would decide the fate of the Roman world. In the end, it was Brutus's left that collapsed, outnumbered and overstretched. The first line broke. They turned and fled. and their panic was a contagion that infected the second line. The entire left wing of the Liberator army dissolved into a mass rout. Octavian's men pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. Some of them stormed Brutus's camp, while others wheeled inwards, falling upon the flank and rear of Brutus's now exposed centre. Brutus's men, who had been locked in a bitter struggle to their front, now found themselves attacked from the side and behind. Finding themselves almost completely surrounded, they too began to break. Brutus, his victorious right wing now a meaningless island in a sea of defeat, was able to cut his way out of the encirclement with 4 legions. They fought their way to the nearby high ground, a last, desperate act of defiance. But the battle had been decisively, catastrophically lost that night under a cold, starless sky. Brutus looked down from the hills at the burning remains of his camp. He saw the campfires of the enemy, stretching for miles across the plain. He knew his cause was dead, his army was shattered, his friends were dead or captured. The dream of a restored republic had died with them in the mud and blood of Philippi. He turned to his friend, Strato, and asked him for one last favour. He asked his friend to hold his sword so that he could fall upon it. Strato refused, begging him to reconsider. But Brutus was calm, resolute. He had made his decision. He was a Stoic, and he would face his end with the dignity his philosophy demanded. He would not be paraded through the streets of Rome in Octavian's triumph. He would choose the manner of his own death. Finally, Strato, his eyes filled with tears, agreed. Brutus took a breath and ran himself through. We do not know the number of casualties. The brutal, infantry-dominant fighting suggests they were horrifically high on both sides. What we do know is that the entirety of the Liberator army that survived the battle surrendered to Antony and Octavian the next day. The legions were divided between the two victors, along with Brutus. Many of the most influential remaining republicans had died in the battle. Marcus Cato, the son of Caesar's famous rival, died fighting with heroic courage, buying time for Brutus to escape. He was reportedly found surrounded by a pile of dead enemies. Antony had made it a priority for his cavalry to hunt down the routing enemy, to capture or kill any of the high-ranking officers they could find. Simba, another of Caesar's assassins, was likely among those killed in the pursuit. Philippi marked the end of the liberators. The men who had plunged the dagger into Caesar were all gone. Decimus Brutus had been hunted down and killed by Gallic chieftains on Antony's orders. Trebonius had been tortured and executed by Dolabella. And now, Cassius and Brutus, the two masterminds, were both dead, suicides on a lost battlefield. As for Brutus, the historical accounts of his fate differ. Suetonius, who delighted in lurid details, claims that Antony had his body beheaded, planning to display the grisly trophy in Rome in front of a statue of Caesar, but that the head was lost in a storm while crossing the Adriatic. Other, perhaps more reliable, sources say that Antony, who had once been a friend of Brutus, treated his body with respect. He had it covered in his own finest purple cloak, cremated in the Roman custom, and then sent the ashes back to Brutus's mother in Rome. In the centuries that followed, Roman historians were torn in their judgment of Brutus and Cassius. On the one hand, they had betrayed and murdered Julius Caesar, a man who was now officially a god, the divine ancestor of the emperors who would rule for generations. In that light, they were traitors and sacrilegious murderers, but on the other hand, they were viewed as brave, virtuous men, paragons of the old republican ideals, who had genuinely believed they were doing what was necessary to save their country from tyranny. Cassius, the man who arguably had the most personal reasons for hating Caesar, was eulogized by Brutus himself as the last of the Romans. He had fought with Pompey. He had refused to fight against other Pompeians when he was later in Caesar's service, and he had genuinely seen Caesar as a mortal threat to the Republic. it is probable that without his driving energy, the assassination would never have happened. For better or for worse, the historian Appian, in his account, points out how extraordinary it was that these two men could win over even Caesar's own veterans, and motivate them to fight against both Caesar's right-hand man and his adopted son. This, he suggests, shows that Brutus and Cassius were not alone in their conviction that they were acting in the Republic's best interests. At the same time, Appian cannot excuse the assassination itself. He views Brutus and Cassius as tragic figures, men of principle who were nevertheless divinely punished by the gods for their sacrilegious attack on Caesar. The armed resistance against the triumvirs would continue, but as Appian wrote, none who came after would hold the same glory as attended Brutus and Cassius. The liberators had been destroyed at Philippi, but the wider cause of the opposition still flickered. Sextus Pompey still controlled the seas from his base in Sicily, and Quintus Labienus, son of Caesar's most brilliant and famous subordinate who had defected to Pompey, was still at large. A talented commander with a burning hatred for the Caesarians. More importantly, the destruction of their common enemy put Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus in sole possession of the Roman world. The three men, who had been allied out of necessity, would soon find that the empire was not big enough for all of them. The war to avenge Caesar was over. The war for his inheritance was about to begin. Rome's civil wars would continue in the grey, corpse-strewn aftermath of Philippi. The dynamic of the Second Triumvirate shifted irrevocably. The war to avenge Caesar was over, but the partnership that had waged it was already beginning to fracture. Antony, as the senior commander who had won the decisive second battle, received the lion's share of the glory. He was now, unquestionably, the most powerful man in the Roman world, Octavian, who had played a part, despite his illness and the rout of his legions in the first battle, also gained significant prestige. But Lepidus, who had been left behind in Rome, received nothing. He had contributed no legions to the great victory, shed no blood on the plains of Macedonia, in the cold calculus of power that followed. He was a non-entity. His irrelevance was compounded by the spoils of war, the victorious armies, a vast pool of tens of thousands of veterans. Now owed their loyalties to Antony and Octavian. None of them owed anything to Lepidus, in their post-victory division of the Republic. Antony and Octavian leveraged this against him with brutal efficiency. They manufactured an accusation, a convenient rumour that Lepidus had been secretly colluding with the pirate king, Sextus Pompey. Whether there was any truth to it is impossible to say. It is just as likely that they invented it as a pretext to strip him of his power. As a result of this supposed treason, the world was redivided between the two true victors. Antony was assigned the entire East, a vast and wealthy domain stretching from Greece to the borders of Parthia. He also kept the now unified province of Gaul. Octavian was given the Hispanic provinces, Sardinia, the islands, and, nominally, Sicily, which was still under the control of Sextus Pompey. He was also given the perilous task of finishing the war with Sextus. Lepidus was given nothing. His provinces were taken from him, his legions reassigned. It was agreed, as a final humiliation, that he would only be granted the minor African provinces once his innocence had been proven. A judgment that was left to Octavian to decide. He had been completely and utterly sidelined, as well as dividing the territories. Antony and Octavian had to deal with the colossal number of soldiers they now commanded, the 19 legions they had brought with them, plus the 14 legions that had surrendered from the Liberator army. Many were retired, their service complete. 6 of the best legions were assigned to Antony for his duties in the east. 5 were assigned to Octavian, but the retired legions, and many others whose terms of service were coming to an end, created a demographic time bomb. A huge number of soldiers, men who had spent their entire adult lives at war, now needed to be paid, discharged, and settled on land of their own. before the Philippi campaign. Antony and Octavian had made them a promise. They had promised them land in some of the richest and most fertile districts of Italy. Now, it was time to fulfill that promise. Antony would go east, to administer his new provinces and prepare for a glorious and profitable war against Parthia. Octavian would return to Italy. He was given the unenviable, politically suicidal task of resettling the veterans. It is almost certain that Antony assigned this task to Octavian deliberately. He knew it was a poisoned chalice. Octavian was trapped in an impossible position. If he kept the promise and gave the veterans the specified lands, he would have to displace thousands of Italian families from their ancestral farms, earning the hatred of the entire civilian population. If he tried to find new, less desirable lands for the veterans, he would risk a massive mutiny from the very soldiers who were the foundation of his power. And if he tried to take land from the wealthy senatorial class, he would alienate the political elite. He was surrounded by enemies, with no good move to make. Faced with this impossible choice, Octavian chose the veterans. His entire career, his very survival, had been built on the loyalty of his army. He could not, under any circumstances, risk alienating them and driving them into Antony's camp. And so, despite knowing the profound unpopularity of the decision, Octavian began the largest and most brutal redistribution of land in Roman history. There were initially 28 legions that needed to be resettled, a number that swelled to 34 as Octavian granted more land to curry favour with other units, taking into account losses and support staff. This may have amounted to more than 150,000 people who needed to be given homes and farms. Such a colossal undertaking required a staggering amount of money, and the state treasury was empty. Octavian was forced to sell off all the remaining property that had been confiscated during the proscriptions. He took vast loans. He emptied the treasuries of the temples. He tried to make concessions to the Senate, avoiding their largest estates. He even found Lepidus not guilty of treason and granted him his African provinces, a move designed to keep the senatorial class sweet. But it was the agrarian middle class of Italy that bore the brunt of the policy. Their land was bought at cut-rate prices, or often simply confiscated. Entire towns were displaced, their populations uprooted to make way for the new military colonies. The social fabric of Italy, already frayed by decades of civil war, was being torn apart in 41 BC. Two new consuls came into power. One was a man named Publius Servilius. The other was Lucius Antonius, another of Mark Antony's brothers, and with him came Antony's wife, Fulvia. Fulvia was not a traditional Roman matron. She was a political animal, ambitious, ruthless, and fiercely intelligent. She and Lucius saw Octavian's predicament as a golden opportunity. They knew that if Octavian was seen as the sole distributor of land, his popularity and influence with the military would soon eclipse their own Antony's. Initially, they tried to delay the settlements, insisting that nothing could be done until Antony, who was by this point living in splendour with Cleopatra in Egypt, returned to Rome. When it became clear that Octavian would not, and could not, allow any delay, they changed tactics. They insisted that Octavian appoint a number of Antony's friends as the leaders of some of the new veteran colonies. This would make it seem as though Antony was also a benefactor, that the land was a gift from both triumvirs. Octavian, despite his victory at Philippi, was still seen as the junior partner. Antony was the hero of the Caesarian party. Octavian could not risk angering him. He was forced to relent to their demands. The situation in Italy was becoming a social and agrarian disaster. Thousands of people were being stripped of their livelihoods. Decades of near-constant war had already deprived Italy of much of its food supply, and the carving up of productive farmland made the situation even worse. Compounding this misery were the pirate fleets that still prowled the seas after Philippi. Mercus had joined his fleet with that of Sextus Pompey in Sicily, while Ahenobarbus remained a threat in the Adriatic. Between them, The Italian peninsula was effectively blockaded. Famine began to spread through Rome and the other cities, and with the famine came riots and violence. Lucius Antonius and Fulvia, seeing the rising tide of popular anger, made another brilliant political pivot. They began to position themselves as the champions of the dispossessed Italian peoples. Lucius argued that Octavian, as one of three triumvirs, could not legally act without the consent of the other two, most importantly, his brother Antony. He argued that the triumvirate had been established to punish the liberators. That task was now complete. Therefore, the triumvirate itself was now nothing more than an illegal tyranny. His party pointed out that there was plenty of land outside of Italy to settle the veterans. It was unfair, they argued, for the Italian people alone to bear the burden of this resettlement. These arguments were incredibly well received. Lucius and Fulvia's popularity soared. They were hailed as saviours of the people. Octavian tried to counter their claims. He painted Lucius as being anti-veteran. He claimed that Antony had given him full authority to distribute the land as he saw fit, but the tide was turning against him. Italy was becoming dangerously divided between those who supported Octavian, mainly the soldiers and veterans, and those who supported Lucius and Fulvia, the aristocracy, the Italian farmers, and the starving urban poor. The situation worsened when Lucius claimed that Octavian had sent assassins to murder him and Antony's young children. He promptly formed a large bodyguard from some of Antony's veterans stationed in Italy. Whether the assassination plot was real or a fabrication is impossible to know. What is certain is that the situation was spiralling out of control. The officers in the army, men loyal to the Caesarian cause as a whole, were horrified at the prospect of another civil war, this time between the triumvirs themselves. They took it upon themselves to try and arbitrate the dispute, but with little success. The stakes rose once again when Fulvia, in a masterful piece of theatre, fled to the protection of Lepidus, claiming she feared for her life and the lives of her children. She and Lucius both sent urgent letters to Antony in Egypt, telling him the same. The legions intervened again, suggesting the matter be taken to an official trial. Both Lucius and Octavian agreed, but on the way to the tribunal, both men sent armed guards ahead of them. The two groups met on the road. Words were exchanged. Then violence broke out. Men on both sides were killed. The negotiations had failed completely. War was now inevitable. Lucius's allies began to mobilize. A longtime supporter of Antony retook the province of Africa, in the Adriatic. The former liberator Ahenobarbus, now allied with Lucius, sailed south and attacked Brundisium, burning a significant part of Octavian's fleet in its harbour. The war had started poorly for Octavian. He immediately summoned a meeting of the Senate. He insisted that he had no quarrel with Mark Antony, and implored them to reason with Lucius. But one of Fulvia's allies in the Senate produced a letter, supposedly from Antony himself, which stated that Lucius should make war if his brother's dignitas, his honour and standing, was attacked. It was a suspiciously vague letter, a blank cheque for war. The Senate, cowed and confused, dropped the issue. Octavian left the city, leaving Lepidus in command of its defence. He knew the matter could now only be settled by force. Lucius had 6 legions under his direct command, and another 11 commanded by Antony's loyal lieutenants, Asinius and Ventidius. In Cisalpine Gaul, Octavian had 4 legions with him, and another 6 under his best general, Salvidianus, stationed just south of Cisalpine Gaul, despite his strong start. Lucius soon ran into trouble. 2 of his legions mutinied. Lucius was able to bribe them back to his side, but Octavian, acting with speed, attacked another of his reinforcing armies and trapped them in the city of Centium, which he promptly besieged. Lucius, in turn, marched on Rome. The city was taken without a fight, his supporters opening the gates to him. Lepidus was forced to flee to Octavian, in Rome. Lucius received official approval from the terrified Senate to wage war as consul. a move that seemed to legitimize his cause. But Octavian could not allow him to hold Rome, leaving Salvidienus to continue the siege of Centium. He took a force and marched back south. The city, still suffering from the famine, was not prepared for another siege. Lucius withdrew his forces without a fight, conceding Rome back to Octavian. Salvidienus, meanwhile, had stormed Centium and taken the city. To counter this, Lucius quickly positioned his army between Octavian and Salvidienus, preventing them from linking up. At the same time, Antony's other generals, Asinius and Ventidius, were approaching Salvidienus from the north, threatening to encircle him. The situation was looking dangerous for Octavian. It was at this moment that another of Octavian's generals, a man who would go on to become one of the greatest in Roman history, seized the initiative. His name was Agrippa, in a brilliant strategic move. Agrippa took a small force and seized the important stronghold of Sutrium, which lay directly on Lucius's line of retreat. The move completely upended Lucius's plans. He was forced to abandon his position to deal with this new threat to his rear. As soon as he moved, Salvidienus and Agrippa both marched against him. Threatening to pin him between their two armies, Lucius was forced into a full retreat north, harassed at every step by Octavian's pursuing forces. It was the first time Agrippa had held a major independent command, and he had already proved himself a master. His bold maneuver had single-handedly turned a potentially disastrous situation into a decisive advantage. Lucius was compelled to make a stand. He threw his army into the heavily fortified hilltop city of Perugia. Sometime late in 41 BC, he found himself trapped, besieged by the combined armies of Octavian, Agrippa, and Salvidienus. The tables had been turned completely. With Lucius besieged, Fulvia, from her headquarters in Praeneste, sent a flurry of desperate messages to Antony's generals, Asinius and Ventidius, imploring them to march to his aid, but the men were reluctant. The sources offer many reasons: insubordination, laziness, incompetence. The truth is likely more complex. These were men loyal to Mark Antony, not to his fiery wife or his reckless brother. They took their orders from Antony, and Antony, a world away in the arms of Cleopatra, had sent no commands. Furthermore, Lucius's cause, his championing of the displaced Italians, was not particularly popular with the soldiers themselves. Who were the beneficiaries of that very displacement? They may have feared that if they marched to fight Octavian, their own men would simply defect to the other side, whatever the true reason. They hesitated. They held back. When Octavian sent detachments of his own army to confront them, they both withdrew without a fight. Another of Antony's commanders, Plancus, was also on his way. But hearing that the others had not committed, he too halted his forces. Lucius, inside the walls of Perugia, was alone. He had roughly 25,000 men, a formidable force, and the city was a natural fortress, perched on a high hill with strong walls. His men had fortified the base of the hill, creating a second line of defence, but outside, Octavian's forces, now numbering as many as 9 legions, perhaps 40,000 men, had constructed a massive ring of fortifications around them. Ditches, walls, and towers. A double line of siege works facing both inwards towards the city and outwards to repel any potential relief army. It was a perfect cage of earth and timber, a tactic learned directly from the playbook of Julius Caesar at Alesia. The rampant famine that had plagued Italy now worked in Octavian's favour. There was little food in the surrounding countryside, and Lucius's men were already running low on supplies. They launched a daring night attack during a religious festival, hoping to catch Octavian's men off guard and cut a path out. But Octavian's soldiers were waiting for them. The fighting was brutal, but the attackers were beaten back. The siege, it was clear, would be decided not by bravery, but by starvation, and by the actions of Antony's generals. After nearly 2 months of hesitation, Ventidius and Asinius at last broke camp and marched toward Perugia. They were joined by the forces of Plancus. They were less than 20 miles from the besieged city. They lit huge signal fires on the hilltops, a message of hope to the starving men inside Perugia, a promise that help was on its way. Morale inside the city soared. Asinius and Ventidius were reportedly eager to press on, to smash through Agrippa's screening force and break the siege. But Plancus, a more cautious commander, pointed out the danger if they attacked Agrippa. Octavian's main force could quickly march from the siege lines and trap them between two armies. A decision had to be made in Perugia. Lucius's men watched the fires anxiously, night after night, waiting for the relief army to appear. When no attack came, they assumed they were simply delayed. They continued to wait until one night. There were no more fires. Ventidius, Asinius, and Plancus had made their decision. They had abandoned him. Lucius would fight alone. The despair inside the city was absolute, growing more desperate. Lucius ordered another night attack, this time throwing his men at almost the entire length of Octavian's defences. The battle raged throughout the night, a chaotic and bloody struggle in the darkness. But ultimately, Octavian's men held the line. Lucius's force was repulsed, their last real hope of a breakout extinguished. The food shortage in the city was now critical. The situation became grotesque. Lucius ordered that no slave be given any food. Most were forced outside the city gates, into the barren no-man's land between the two armies, where they tried to survive by eating grass. Most of them died there, their bodies littering the ground between the warring camps. Lucius's soldiers, in a final act of desperation, begged him to let them try one last sally. They gathered all the ladders and siege hooks they had left. They brought out what Appian calls folding towers, makeshift siege engines built inside the city, rather than attacking across the whole line. They focused their assault on a few specific points, hoping to create a breach. They fought with the courage of doomed men, scaling the walls, initially seeming to gain the upper hand in the fierce hand-to-hand fighting. But Octavian had been holding his best troops in reserve. Once the men fighting on the walls on both sides were exhausted, he committed his fresh reserves. They stormed the battlements, throwing Lucius's men from the walls and destroying the wooden planks that connected the siege towers to the ramparts. Lucius's forces were trapped. Under a constant hail of missile fire, he ordered a retreat, but some of his men, driven by a suicidal bravery, tried again to scale the walls with ladders, only to be cut down. The siege, which had lasted for nearly 6 months, was over. Lucius's men had suffered terrible losses. More were deserting every day. It was clear that no help was coming. He could do little more than try to save the lives of the men who remained. A delegation of peace was sent to Octavian. The reply was cold and unambiguous. He would be lenient to all, except his enemies. Lucius and his men surrendered. Octavian spared the common soldiers, even welcoming many of Antony's veterans into his own ranks. But the nobles on Lucius's side, the senators and equites who had challenged him, were not so lucky. As many as 300 of them were taken to an altar dedicated to the divine Julius Caesar, and, on the anniversary of his murder, the Ides of March, they were executed as a human sacrifice. The ancient city of Perugia itself was burned to the ground. The sources disagree on whether this was on Octavian's orders or an accident in the chaos of the surrender. Lucius himself, surprisingly, was forgiven. Octavian, in a shrewd political move, made him a governor in faraway Iberia, hoping to use him as a pawn against his own brother. The Prussian War was over. Lucius's motivations have long been a source of debate. Was he a cynical opportunist who exploited the suffering of the Italian people for his own gain, or was he, as he claimed, a true republican, fighting to restore the patrician government that had been subverted by the triumvirate's tyranny? Appian certainly believed the latter. recording a defiant speech in which Lucius declares his cause was for his country, not for his brother, or for Fulvia, or for power. It is a noble sentiment, but it is hard to separate it from the ambition that so clearly drove his family. Fulvia's motivation is even more difficult to discern. The Roman historians, uniformly hostile to powerful women, attribute her actions to little more than womanly jealousy of Cleopatra, but they also make it clear that she was a formidable political operator, a woman who, for a time, wielded the power of a consul. Perhaps jealousy was a factor, but it is just as likely that she was a deeply ambitious woman who used her husband's power to further her own interests, in this case, by trying to oust Octavian. She was one of the first in a long line of powerful imperial wives who would shape the history of Rome from the shadows. Following the end of the war, Antony's remaining lieutenants in Italy dispersed. Most of their legions, along with their commanders, eventually joined up with the fleet of Ahenobarbus and threw their lot in with Antony. Octavian himself, his position in Italy now secure, seized control of Gaul, which had been left leaderless by the death of Antony's governor. Antony's family was forced to flee Italy. His mother went to the protection of Sextus Pompey in Sicily, and Fulvia, the woman who had started the war, took refuge in Athens, in the east. Antony had seemed content to let the situation in Italy play itself out. It is unlikely he ever approved of his brother's republican posturing. Antony was a man whose power was built on the army. He would never have endorsed a position that threatened his relationship with his soldiers. He had spent most of 41 and 40 BC in Alexandria, living with Cleopatra and preparing for a grand campaign against the Parthians. But now, the news of his brother's defeat, the loss of his legions in Italy, the flight of his family, and, most importantly, the loss of Gaul to Octavian, made him look weak. He was forced to postpone his invasion and return to Italy to reassert his authority. On his way, he was met by one of Sextus Pompey's top advisors, who was escorting Antony's mother to safety. In return for this favour, Antony promised to ally himself with Sextus against their common enemy, Octavian. It was a promise that would prove to be short-lived. For now, however, Antony pushed on, landing his forces near Brundisium sometime in mid-40 BC. But the city was garrisoned by Octavian's men, and they refused him entry. Antony was forced to besiege the city, while simultaneously sending word to his new ally, Sextus, to attack Italy wherever he could. Sextus acted swiftly, seizing the island of Sardinia and landing an invasion force in the south of Italy. Agrippa was able to repel the invasion, but all-out war between the two remaining triumvirs seemed inevitable. And then, suddenly, news reached Antony that his wife, Fulvia, had died of an illness in Greece. Her death, tragic as it may have been for her family, provided a political opportunity. There were many in the camps of both Octavian and Antony, veterans who had fought side by side at Philippi just 2 years earlier, who had no desire to fight each other. They implored both men to make peace. Neither commander could risk losing the loyalty of his legions, and both were on shaky moral ground. Octavian had just waged war against Antony's own brother. Antony had allied himself with a public enemy, Sextus Pompey, and encouraged him to attack Italy. The hypocrisy of Antony, previously accusing Lepidus of conspiring with Sextus, while now doing it himself, was lost on no one. The situation was a mess, and both men were eager to save face. And so, around September of 40 BC, they made an agreement, the Treaty of Brundisium. The treaty reaffirmed the Second Triumvirate. It redivided the Roman world once more. Octavian would receive all territories west of a designated line in Illyria. Antony would receive everything to the east. Lepidus, the forgotten triumvir, was confirmed in his possession of Africa. The treaty was to be cemented by a marriage. Antony, now a widower, would marry Octavian's beloved sister, Octavia. The two men returned to Rome in a staged triumphal procession to celebrate the marriage and their renewed friendship, as a sign of this new trust. Antony revealed a secret to Octavian. He produced letters that proved that Salvidienus, one of Octavian's oldest friends and his most talented general before Agrippa, had been secretly planning to desert to Antony's side during the Prussian War. Betrayed. Octavian summoned Salvidienus to Rome. He was tried, condemned, and promptly executed. Agrippa was now, indisputably, Octavian's right-hand man. The Prussian War was over, but the endless cycle of violence and betrayal showed no signs of stopping, while Antony and Octavian carved up the world and cemented their fragile peace with a political marriage. The war in the East had taken a disastrous turn. Following Philippi, Antony had briefly wintered in Athens, indulging his love for the city's literature and philosophy. Before crossing into Asia Minor in the spring of 41 BC, his task was immense to re-establish Roman control over a vast territory that had recently sworn allegiance to Brutus and Cassius, and to extract enough wealth from its provinces to cover the triumvirate's colossal expenses. He proved to be a remarkably shrewd administrator, a man who understood that power was a delicate balance of fear and favour. For the cities that had sided with the liberators, his judgment was harsh, a heavy tribute. 9 years' worth of taxes to be paid in a single instalment was demanded. Local kings, tyrants, and vassals who had backed the wrong side were deposed, replaced with men loyal to the Caesarian cause. But at the same time, Antony was careful to reward those who had remained loyal to Caesar. The Rhodians, who had suffered under Cassius, were given more land. The Lycians, whose people had been devastated by Brutus's brutal siege of Xanthus, were exempted from taxes entirely. It was a rare glimpse into the talent Antony possessed beyond the battlefield, a man using threats and mercy in equal measure to quickly bring the fractured eastern provinces back into the fold. During this grand tour, Antony was already planning for the ultimate prize, a full-scale invasion of Parthia, the one great empire that had defied Roman power. It was the campaign Caesar himself had been planning at the time of his death. To undertake such a monumental task, Antony knew that the support of Egypt, Rome's most powerful and wealthy client state in the East, would be vital, and so he sent a summons to its queen, Cleopatra, requesting that she meet him in the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. It was not the first time they had met. Antony had surely known her when she lived in Rome as Caesar's lover, but this meeting would be different. This was not a meeting between a Roman general and a client monarch. It was a meeting of two of the most powerful and ambitious people in the world, and it was here, in the perfumed air of a provincial capital, that Antony, like Caesar before him, was said to have fallen under the spell of Cleopatra's wit, intelligence, and beauty. From Tarsus, Antony travelled to Syria, continuing his work of administration. Replacing local rulers who had sided with the liberators, many of the deposed men fled east, seeking refuge at the court of the Parthian king. Once his work in Syria was done, Antony travelled to Alexandria to spend the winter with his new lover, as he had in Athens. He immersed himself in the local culture. He frequented the great library and the schools of philosophy. He embraced the Greek style of dress and the luxurious, sophisticated way of life that defined the Ptolemaic court, and he spent a great deal of his time with Cleopatra. Their affair, born of political necessity, deepened into a genuine partnership. It eventually resulted in the birth of twins, a boy named Alexander Helios and a girl named Cleopatra Selene. Later, Roman historians, writing under the influence of Octavian's propaganda, would scorn this period of Antony's life. They would paint him as a man who had gone native, who had abandoned his Roman identity, who cared less and less for the affairs of his own country. They called him Cleopatra's slave, a once great man whose virtue was being dissipated and destroyed by a foreign enchantress. These damning assessments must be viewed with caution. Roman writers were almost uniformly hostile to powerful foreign women, but it is impossible to deny that the relationship was, at least initially, a mutually beneficial alliance. Antony secured the backing of Egypt's immense wealth and resources for his Parthian campaign. Cleopatra, in turn, used Antony's power to solidify her own rule and eliminate her rivals. Most notably, she had her younger sister, Arsinoe, who had once challenged her for the throne, dragged from the sanctuary of a temple in Ephesus and executed on Antony's orders. It was while Antony was in Alexandria, sometime in the early months of 40 BC, that the storm broke on the eastern frontier. The Parthians, sensing a moment of Roman weakness, launched a massive invasion into Syria. The invasion was led by a formidable duo, the Parthian crown prince, Pacorus, and, shockingly, a Roman. His name was Quintus Labienus, son of the great Titus Labienus, Caesar's most brilliant general who would later become his most bitter enemy. The Parthian army, consisting of tens of thousands of their legendary cataphracts and horse archers, swept across the border. Lucius Decidius Saxa, the governor Antony had appointed to Syria, quickly gathered what forces he had, likely 2 legions, and met the invaders. He was easily defeated in open battle, his slow-moving infantry no match for the superior numbers and mobility of the Parthian cavalry. The Roman eagles were captured. Saxa himself fled, first to Antioch and then to Cilicia, but he was soon hunted down and executed. Antony's careful work in the east began to unravel with terrifying speed. There were still many Pompeian sympathizers in Syria, which had been Cassius's home province. The name of Labienus, son of the great Pompeian hero, carried immense weight, and the Parthians brought with them many of the local rulers Antony had recently deposed. As a result, with Saxa dead, many of the Roman garrisons and cities in Syria surrendered without a fight. Welcoming Labienus as a liberator, the invading force then split. Labienus, at the head of a new army of Roman defectors and local recruits, pushed north into Cilicia and Asia Minor. Pacorus focused on subjugating the rest of Syria, with almost no resistance. He seized control of the entire province, save for the famously impregnable city of Tyre. He then pushed south into the Roman client kingdom of Judea, deposing the pro-Roman king and installing an anti-Roman usurper on the throne. Labienus, meanwhile, was just as successful, winning over city after city in Cilicia, facing serious resistance only from a few loyalist holdouts, which were eventually taken and sacked. All of this had happened in a matter of months. The entire Roman East was on the verge of collapse, and Antony had failed to act. Perhaps, as his enemies later claimed, he was too distracted by the luxuries of Alexandria, or perhaps the Parthian invasion had been too swift, too overwhelming for him to muster a concerted response in time. Either way, it was not until the spring that he finally sailed from Alexandria to Tyre to address the crisis. But it was at this point that he received the devastating news from Italy: his brother's defeat, his wife's flight, the loss of Gaul to Octavian. His entire political position in the West was in jeopardy, forced to choose between his duty in the East and his survival in the West. Antony made a fateful decision. He rushed back to Italy with a majority of his legions, effectively abandoning the eastern provinces to the invaders. His absence allowed Labienus to make even greater gains, pushing all the way to the Ionian coast. Not since the days of Mithridates the Great had Rome suffered such a catastrophic defeat in the east. While Antony sailed west to confront Octavian, the peace he had left behind was already crumbling. The Treaty of Brundisium had been celebrated in Rome, but the underlying tensions remained. Sextus Pompey still presented a problem. His piracy and blockades had continued, and so had the famines. While Antony and Octavian were in Rome for the wedding celebrations, the people, pushed to the breaking point by starvation, rioted in the Forum. Octavian, attempting to calm the crowd, was pelted with stones and nearly torn apart. Antony was forced to intervene, bringing soldiers into the sacred heart of the city. His men held back the crowd, but some civilians were killed in the ensuing panic, a tragic stampede that only deepened the people's anger. It was clear this could not continue. To prepare for peace talks with Sextus, Octavian entered into another political marriage. He married Scribonia, the sister of one of Sextus's closest advisors, a man named Libo. It was Libo who had brokered the earlier, short-lived alliance between Antony and Sextus, and it was he who now arranged a meeting between the three men at Misenum. At the start of 39 BC, the negotiation started poorly. Sextus, at the height of his power, assumed he would be offered a place in the triumvirate, replacing the disgraced Lepidus. Antony and Octavian flatly refused. The negotiations continued, with the triumvirs offering to forgive any of the proscribed men who had fled to Sextus, and to return a portion of their confiscated property for many in Sextus's camp. This was an offer too good to refuse. They immediately pressured Sextus to accept. Sextus had hoped to draw out the negotiations. He knew the famine was his greatest weapon. The longer he waited, the stronger his position became. But under the mounting pressure from his own faction, men who were desperate to return to their homes and families in Rome, he was forced to make peace quickly. The terms were agreed. Sextus would cease his blockades and piracy. He would withdraw his troops from the Italian mainland, and he would immediately send shipments of grain to Rome. In return, the proscribed Pompeians would be allowed to return and have a quarter of their property restored. The thousands of runaway slaves who had flocked to his army would be granted their freedom, and Sextus himself would be made the legal governor of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the province of Achaia in Greece. The treaty was sealed by yet another marriage, this time between Sextus's young daughter and Octavian's nephew. For the powerful position Sextus had been in, it was a relatively poor deal. He already had effective control of the islands. The only real prize he gained was Achaia. He was well aware of this and was furious at the advisors who had pressured him into accepting. Rather than allowing him to hold out for better terms, one of his commanders even suggested that he take advantage of the celebratory banquet being held on his flagship and have both Antony and Octavian assassinated. Sextus, to his credit, refused, claiming he could not break his word. Meanwhile, Antony and Octavian had benefited massively from the treaty. The recalling of Sextus's ships and the grain he sent immediately ended the famine. The two triumvirs returned to a hero's welcome in Rome. With affairs in Italy settled for the moment, Antony established his headquarters in Athens. From there, he could monitor the fragile peace in the west while mustering his forces for a huge counter-invasion of Parthia. To lead this counterattack, he selected his general, Publius Ventidius. This was the same Ventidius who had failed to come to Lucius's aid during the siege of Perugia. Antony, a sound military strategist, was also a shrewd politician. By giving Ventidius this command, he was showing his trust, and perhaps signalling that Ventidius had done exactly what Antony had wanted by not supporting his reckless brother. Ventidius was a new man, a commoner who had risen through the ranks on sheer talent. He had started as a mule driver before joining the army and serving with distinction under Caesar in Gaul. The fact that Antony now entrusted him with the fate of the entire Roman East shows the immense faith he had in his subordinate's ability. At the start of spring, 39 BC, Ventidius crossed into Asia Minor with a force of at least 4 legions. He aimed to establish a foothold for Antony's main invasion. He knew that while Labienus had moved quickly, he had overextended himself, leaving his Parthian allies far behind in Syria when confronted with Ventidius's larger, more disciplined force. Labienus had no choice but to retreat. Hoping to link up with the Parthians, Ventidius pursued him relentlessly, leading his light infantry and cavalry in a forced march to cut him off. He overtook Labienus near the Taurus Mountains and took the high ground. A classic Roman tactic. A standoff ensued, Ventidius waiting for his heavy infantry to catch up, and Labienus waiting for his Parthian allies. The The reinforcements for both sides arrived on the same day. The Parthians, still buoyed by their easy victory over Saxa the previous year, were overconfident. They did not wait to coordinate with Labienus. They formed up at the base of the hill and charged Ventidius. In a brilliant display of battlefield discipline, kept his main force inside his camp. Encouraged by this perceived cowardice, the Parthians charged up the steep incline. When they were halfway up the slope, bogged down and losing momentum, Ventidius unleashed his legions. They sallied out of the camp and crashed down the hill into the Parthian cavalry, caught unawares, fighting uphill. The Parthians stood no chance against the heavy Roman infantry. Many were killed in the initial shock, and the rest were routed. Their stampede downhill causing even more chaos and casualties, they fled the field completely, abandoning Labienus and his men, who were still deployed in battle formation. Labienus, his allies gone, tried to slip away in the night, but deserters from his camp informed Ventidius of his plan. Ventidius laid an ambush, and in the darkness, Labienus's retreating army was destroyed. Labienus himself was captured and executed, with a single, decisive victory. Ventidius had secured Asia Minor. He then marched on the Amanus Pass, the gateway to Syria. Finding it garrisoned by the Parthians, he laid another trap, using his cavalry to feign a retreat and lure the Parthians into an ambush by his waiting legions. The Parthian commander was killed, and the rest of his force was routed. Hearing of this second defeat, Prince Pacorus withdrew all his remaining forces from Syria. Ventidius had, in a single, brilliant campaign, retaken the entirety of the Roman East. He then began the process of restoring Roman authority, including sending a detachment of troops to help Herod, the pro-Roman claimant, retake the kingdom of Judea. The Parthian threat had been stalled, but it had not been eliminated. The Parthian invasion had been stalled, but it had not been broken. At the start of the following year, 38 BC, Prince Pacorus, eager to avenge his previous defeat and the death of his commanders, began amassing a second, even larger invasion force. He gathered between 20 and 30,000 soldiers, an army of cataphracts and horse archers, and prepared to once again cross the Euphrates. At this time, Ventidius's legions were scattered, still in their winter quarters across Syria and Cappadocia. He was vulnerable. He needed to buy himself time to gather his forces, according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio. Ventidius resorted to a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. He used a local Arab prince, a man known to be a double agent, to spread disinformation to the Parthians. The prince claimed that Ventidius was not afraid of a crossing at the usual point near Zeugma. The hilly terrain there favoured the Roman infantry. What Ventidius truly feared, the prince whispered, was a crossing further down the river, where the flat, open plains would give the Parthian cavalry a decisive advantage. Pacorus, according to the story, took the bait. He marched his army 40 days downstream to find a suitable crossing point on the plains, a delay that gave Ventidius exactly the time he needed to muster his forces and prepare for the invasion. It is a story that paints the Parthian prince as a gullible fool, and some modern historians, justifiably, have questioned its accuracy. They point out that Roman sources were notoriously biased, always eager to portray their enemies as easily duped. Pacorus was a talented and experienced commander. It is perhaps more likely that he deliberately waited, hoping to lure Ventidius into committing his entire army to a single, decisive battle where he could be annihilated. In either case, the outcome was the same. By the time the Parthians crossed the Euphrates, Ventidius was ready for them. The two armies met near Mount Ginderus in Syria. Ventidius, once again, encamped his legions on the high ground, a position that maximised their defensive strength and negated the mobility of the Parthian cavalry. His army of roughly 4 legions, plus light infantry and slingers he had recruited from local populations, was approximately the same size as that of Pacorus. When the Parthians drew up for battle at the base of the mountain, Ventidius used the same devastatingly effective ploy as before. He kept his army hidden inside their fortified camp, projecting an image of fear and weakness. The Parthian horse archers, confident and eager, advanced up the slope first, a wave of fast-moving skirmishers. Ventidius waited. He held his nerve until the last possible moment. Then he unleashed part of his force in a sudden, ferocious sally. The Parthians, caught completely by surprise, were cut down, and the remainder were chased back down the hill in a chaotic retreat. Pacorus, seeing this, made a fatal miscalculation, assuming that his horse archers had lured out the entirety of Ventidius's army. He now advanced up the hill with his elite heavy cavalry, the fearsome cataphracts, intending to smash the disorganized Roman infantry and storm the camp. Suddenly, Ventidius attacked with the rest of his legions and his thousands of slingers who had been held in reserve, with the immense advantage of the high ground. The Roman infantry easily blunted the charge of the armoured cavalry. The hail of lead sling bullets and heavy javelins thrown from above was devastating. The cataphracts were repulsed. Forced back down the hill, Pacorus managed to rally his men at the base and organised a desperate resistance, but they found themselves under a relentless barrage of missiles from the Roman slingers on the high ground. In the brutal fighting that followed, Pacorus, the Parthian crown prince, was killed. Some of his royal guard fought fiercely to recover his body, but the combination of disciplined Roman heavy infantry to their front and the intense fire from the slingers above proved too much. The Parthian army broke completely. The majority of the invading force was annihilated. Ventidius's casualties were minimal. He immediately marched on the Parthian allied kingdom of Commagene and laid siege to its capital. Antony arrived from Greece soon after, taking over the final stages of the siege. He seems to have been deeply jealous of his subordinates' achievements, and not without reason. In 2 short campaigns, Ventidius had won 3 decisive battles, secured the entire Roman East, and inflicted Rome's first ever major victory over a full Parthian army. The death of Pacorus sparked a succession crisis in Parthia, further securing Rome's eastern border for years to come. Antony removed the brilliant general from his command. Ventidius returned to Rome a hero. He became the first Roman in history to be awarded a triumph for a victory over the Parthians. He then disappears from the historical record, his meteoric career ending as abruptly as it began. The death of Quintus Labienus and the victories of Ventidius meant that there was now effectively only one major republican leader left, Sextus Pompey, and while Ventidius had been securing the east, the fragile peace that had been agreed upon at Misenum had frayed and snapped. While Antony was in Athens, Sextus had demanded control of the province of Achaia, as had been agreed in the treaty. Antony, in turn, demanded the tax revenue from the province to fund his Parthian campaign. Sextus refused. To make matters worse for Sextus, one of his best admirals and governors, a man named Menas, defected to Octavian, handing over control of Sardinia and Corsica, along with 3 legions. In response, Sextus once again unleashed his fleet to raid Italian shipping. By the start of 38 BC, the peace was in tatters. Octavian, who had likely been looking for an excuse to undermine the treaty from the beginning, now had his pretext. To add a deeply personal insult to the political provocations, he divorced his wife Scribonia, the relative of Sextus's closest advisor. Immediately after, she gave birth to his one and only natural child, his daughter Julia, by the spring. Octavian's forces were amassed. He had raised new legions from the provinces of Illyria, Gaul, and Hispania. He now commanded a vast army and a newly built fleet of perhaps 200 warships. He was ready for war. He planned a 2-pronged invasion of Sicily. One fleet, sailing from Etruria in the north, would be commanded by the defector Menas and another general named Calvisius. The second fleet, leaving from Tarentum in the south, would be commanded by Octavian himself, his army. Meanwhile, would march down to the toe of Italy, ready to be ferried across the straits once the Pompeian fleet had been destroyed. Sextus, hearing of these movements, split his own navy. He commanded one squadron in Messana, waiting for Octavian, while sending another under his freedman, Menecrates, to confront the northern fleet. Menecrates found the fleet under Minas and Calvisius near Cumae. The Pompeian admiral, a daring and aggressive commander, immediately attacked. The battle was a disaster for Octavian. His ships, pushed back towards the shore, were either beached or smashed against the rocks in the fighting. Menecrates' ship rammed that of his rival, the defector Minas. The two crews engaged in a furious battle on their decks. Both commanders were wounded. Minas was shot through the arm with an arrow. Menecrates took a javelin to the thigh, but as Menas's men gradually got the upper hand, Menecrates, unwilling to be taken captive, flung himself into the sea and drowned. Despite this small success, the battle was a clear defeat for Octavian. His fleet had been mauled, losing far more ships than the Pompeians. The remnants, now under the command of Calvisius, limped south to join Octavian. Octavian had, by now, reached Rhegium. His generals, hearing that Sextus only had 40 ships with him in Messana, urged him to attack immediately. But Octavian, not yet knowing the outcome of the battle at Cumae, insisted on waiting for Calvisius and Minas. It was a serious blunder. The delay allowed the victorious Pompeian fleet to return from Cumae and reunite with Sextus. When news of the defeat finally reached him, Octavian decided to sail through the straits to meet his battered northern fleet, as he did. His fleet was set upon by Sextus's entire navy. Octavian, reluctant to fight without his reinforcements, ordered his ships to continue on without engaging. Several were cut off and destroyed. The arrival of Calvisius's fleet put a temporary end to the fighting as night fell. But Octavian's Sicilian invasion was already a catastrophe. He had lost many ships in the first battle, and still more to Sextus's harassing tactics in the straits, as he tried to consolidate his forces and conduct repairs near the coast. Disaster struck again. A massive storm swept through the straits. Sextus's fleet, safe in Sicilian harbours, rode it out, but Octavian's ships, exposed near the coast, were dashed against the rocks and against one another. The infamous whirlpools of the straits drowned hundreds of men who were thrown overboard. The cries of the dying were said to have lasted throughout the night. By the time the storm finally broke, most of Octavian's fleet, and the men who crewed it, were gone. By the summer of 38 BC, Octavian was forced to admit his invasion had been a total failure. He made his way to Vibo, sending out urgent messages to his allies to be prepared for a potential invasion of Italy by Sextus. When Sextus got word of how devastating the storm had been, he was ecstatic. He saw it not as a stroke of luck, but as a sign of divine favour. He began to style himself as the son of Neptune, but despite the significant losses Octavian had suffered, Sextus did not press his advantage. He was not confident he had the manpower to pull off a full-scale invasion of the mainland. It was a moment of hesitation that would cost him everything. Octavian, however, was not a man to give up, humiliated but not broken. He sent word to Antony, requesting his support, and, most importantly, he recalled his best friend and most brilliant subordinate from Gaul, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, who had been busy quelling revolts on the frontier, was coming home. Octavian would prepare for another invasion, but this time, Agrippa would lead it. Agrippa was made consul for the year 37 BC. Despite being well under the legal age for the office, he immediately undertook the colossal task of building a new, even larger fleet for Octavian, but he soon realised a critical problem. There was no harbour on the west coast of Italy large and secure enough to house such a vast armada, let alone build it in secret, safe from the raids of Sextus's ships. Undeterred, Agrippa began the construction of one of the greatest engineering achievements of the Roman Republic, the Portus Julius. He knew that the deep, volcanic crater lake of Averno, located just inland from the Bay of Naples, was completely hidden from any ship sailing along the coast. He planned to make this the heart of his new harbour. His engineers dug a canal linking Lake Averno to the shallower Lake Lucrino, and then a second, larger canal from Lucrino to the sea. The harbour he built was large enough to hold the entire fleet and to conduct large-scale training manoeuvres, combined with a massive tunnel that was cut through the hills to connect the port to the nearby city of Cumae. The Portus Julius was a marvel of logistics and engineering. It was a secret naval base where an entire fleet could be built, trained and supplied, completely hidden from the eyes of the enemy. The ruins of this incredible feat of engineering can still be seen today, submerged under the waters of the Bay of Naples, in the spring of 37 BC. Octavian's position improved further when Antony arrived in Tarentum with 300 warships to assist in the invasion. But Octavian was not yet ready. Many of his ships were still under construction. Antony, who was eager to get on with his own delayed Parthian campaign, was frustrated by the delay, but he persisted, hoping Octavian would repay the favour by providing him with legions for his own war. The two men met. The negotiations were tense. Octavian was still angry that Antony had not sent help the previous year. It was Antony's new wife, Octavian's sister Octavia, who acted as the peacemaker. She convinced the two men to reconcile. They renewed the triumvirate for another 5 years. Antony, unable to postpone his own war any longer, offered a compromise. He would gift Octavian 130 of his own warships in return. Octavian promised to send 4 of his legions to Antony for the Parthian campaign. Octavian gladly accepted. Meanwhile, the unpredictable Admiral Minas defected yet again. Abandoning Octavian and returning to Sextus's side, the general Calvisius, who had failed to stop him, was removed from his command. Agrippa was made the supreme commander of Octavian's entire navy. By the spring of 36 BC, Octavian was finally ready. He had a fleet of roughly 300 ships and 21 legions handpicked for the invasion. Lepidus, in Africa, was also ready with another 70 warships and 12 legions. The plan was simple and massive. 3-pronged assault that would overwhelm Sicily from all sides. The invasion began, and once again, it was plagued by disaster. In the spring of 36 BC, Octavian was ready. His new fleet, forged in secret by the genius of Agrippa, was a marvel of naval power. Combined with Antony's ships and Lepidus's forces from Africa, he had assembled one of the largest invasion forces in history. The plan was simple, a 3-pronged assault from the north, east and south that would overwhelm Sicily from all sides. The invasion began, and once again, it was met by disaster. A massive storm, of even greater ferocity than the one 2 years prior, swept up from the south. Lepidus, sailing from Africa, was hit the hardest. Nearly 1,000 of his vital supply ships were sunk. Octavian and Agrippa's section of the fleet was also battered, forcing them to limp back to Italy for a month of frantic repairs. But despite these catastrophic setbacks, Lepidus's main military convoy had pushed through before the storm hit. His legions had successfully landed on the western coast of Sicily. They laid siege to the Pompeian stronghold of Lilybaeum and began winning over other cities in the area. The invasion, though crippled, had secured a vital foothold, emboldened. Lepidus tried to transport 4 more legions across from Africa, but this time without a proper escort. The slow-moving transports were intercepted by a squadron of Sextus's fleet. 2 legions worth of men were lost in the crossing. Still, Sextus acted with a strange caution. He kept his main fleet safe in port. This lack of aggressive action caused his recently returned admiral, the mercurial Minas, to once again change sides. He defected back to Octavian, who accepted him readily, but kept him under close watch. With Sextus still refusing to commit his fleet, Octavian grew more aggressive. leaving Agrippa in command of the main fleet. He took 3 legions and sailed east, intending to lead Antony's squadron in an attack from that direction. At the same time, Agrippa would continue to press from the north. Agrippa sailed to the city of Mylae, where he had learned that a Pompeian admiral, Demochares, was stationed with 40 ships. He was hoping for a quick, easy victory, but Sextus had anticipated the move. He sailed personally from Messana with another 75 ships, concentrating almost his entire navy at Mylae. When Agrippa realised he was now facing the full might of the Pompeian fleet, he immediately sent for the rest of his own ships and drew up his current force for battle. The Pompeian fleet was slightly larger, and their crews were more experienced. Their ships were lighter and faster, designed for manoeuvrability, for outsailing and disabling their opponents. Agrippa's fleet, on the other hand, had heavier, slower ships, built to be stable fighting platforms. They were designed for boarding, for turning a naval battle into a land battle on water, where their superior heavy infantry could win the day. The battle commenced. The Pompeian ships danced around the heavier Caesarian vessels, their skilled crews using their superior speed to shear off oars and isolate individual ships. But when they got too close, they were quickly grappled and pulled in, from their higher decks and towers. Agrippa's marines rained down a shower of missiles before boarding, on the decks of the captured ships. The fighting was brutal, but the veteran legionaries were in their element. Agrippa, in his flagship, located the ship of the Pompeian commander and engaged it, shattering its hull with a powerful ram. The Pompeian admiral was forced to escape to another vessel. Sextus, watching from the shoreline, realised the battle was going against him. Seeing Agrippa's reinforcements approaching on the horizon, he ordered a withdrawal. The Pompeian ships executed a skillful retreat to a series of nearby shoals, where Agrippa's heavier ships could not pursue them. It was a clear victory for the Caesarians. Agrippa had lost only 5 ships while capturing or destroying 30 of the enemies. After years of humiliating disasters at sea, Octavian's forces, under the command of Agrippa, had finally won a significant naval success. Hearing of the victory, Octavian was eager to capitalise on it. He sailed with his own 3 legions and the rest of the navy, landing his forces near the town of Tauromenium in the east. He had, however, fatally underestimated his opponent, Sextus, leaving a small squadron at Mylae to create the illusion that his fleet was still there, sailed the majority of his ships under the cover of darkness. As Octavian's men began to fortify their new camp, they looked up to see the entire Pompeian fleet closing in on their ships. While the Pompeian army advanced along the coast, Octavian was trapped. Recognizing that his land forces were now cut off, he left them under the command of a trusted subordinate, Cornificius, and took to the ships himself. He assumed that his larger fleet could replicate Agrippa's success. He was wrong. The resulting battle was another catastrophe for Octavian. His fleet was shattered. The sailors who abandoned their sinking ships and tried to swim to shore were cut down by the Pompeian cavalry waiting for them on the beaches. Octavian himself barely escaped with his life, instead of retreating to his besieged legions on Sicily. He was forced to flee back to the Italian mainland in a small boat. He was humiliated and alone, his army abandoned, his fleet once again destroyed in Sicily. Cornificius realised his situation was dire, with his supply line cut. It was only a matter of time before his 3 legions were starved into submission. He tried to offer battle, but the Pompeians refused to engage. He had no choice. He would have to march his men north, through miles of hostile territory, to reach the safety of Agrippa's camp. The march was a nightmare. The legions formed a hollow square, with the wounded in the centre, and began their trek. They were constantly harassed by Sextus's missile troops and his superb Numidian light cavalry, who struck and retreated, striking and retreating, whittling down the Roman column day after day. The summer heat was oppressive. Water was scarce. The constant attacks made it impossible for them to forage. After 5 days of dehydration and relentless harassment, Cornificius's men were at their breaking point. Sextus's main force began to close in for the final kill, but suddenly, 3 of Agrippa's legions appeared, a relief force sent to find them. The Pompeian forces, unwilling to risk a pitched battle, melted away. The exhausted, half-dead remnants of Cornificius's legions were finally safe. Agrippa, in the meantime, had captured the stronghold of Tyndaris. Octavian rejoined him there, bringing still more legions from the mainland. He now had a staggering 21 legions in Sicily, not including the forces under Lepidus. In the face of this overwhelming opposition, Sextus was forced to retreat. Pulling all his forces into the northeastern corner of the island, Lepidus, his own operations in the west having stalled, marched his army across the island to join Octavian and Agrippa. The fate of the Pompeians was now effectively sealed. Sextus was pinned in, with the city of Messana as his last major holdout. But as the military noose tightened, the political alliance of the victors began to fray. Lepidus had become an increasing problem. He argued constantly with Octavian, insisting that he should have equal command. He was not wrong. His campaign, while not spectacular, had been far more successful than Octavian's own disastrous efforts. There was a real threat that Lepidus, with his own large army, could supplant Octavian as the second most powerful man in Rome. Rumours even circulated that he was in secret communication with Sextus. Octavian knew he no longer had the luxury of a long siege. He needed a swift, decisive, and total victory. One that would not only crush Sextus, but also establish his own undisputed authority over Lepidus. With time running out, Sextus knew he had only one option left. He had to risk everything on a single, final naval battle. He had to break Agrippa's fleet and open a route for supplies and, if necessary, an escape. The 2 fleets, each numbering approximately 300 ships, met off the coast of Naulicus. Sextus had learned from his previous engagement, building larger, heavier ships to match the Caesarian vessels. But Agrippa had his own new innovation, a secret weapon he had developed in the hidden harbour of Portus Julius. It was called the harpax. Roman ships had previously used a heavy, clumsy boarding bridge called the corvus. The harpax was something new. It was a massive iron grappling hook, attached to a long rope, which was fired from a catapult-like device on the deck. It could be fired from a distance, and its long metal sheath prevented the ropes from being easily cut. Once it was embedded in an enemy hull, a powerful winch would drag the captured ship in close, where it could be boarded and overwhelmed by the legionaries. The battle began, and it quickly became apparent that Agrippa's invention was a game-changer. Sextus's men had never seen anything like it. They had no defence against it. Ships that were caught by the harpax were dragged inexorably towards Agrippa's vessels. The superior seamanship of the Pompeians was rendered useless. The battle devolved into a series of hundreds of individual ship-to-ship boarding actions. Exactly the kind of fight Agrippa wanted, from the shoreline. The massed armies of both sides watched, their shouts of encouragement lost in the din of battle. But it soon became clear to all that Agrippa had a decisive, battle-winning advantage. Sextus's fleet was being systematically destroyed. A few of his ships managed to escape, Sextus among them, but the vast majority of the Pompeian fleet was either captured, sunk, or driven onto the beaches and burned. Agrippa had lost only 3 ships. It was his finest hour, a victory of tactics, technology, and sheer brute force that had given Octavian the clear. Unambiguous triumph he so desperately needed. In the immediate aftermath, Sextus fled to Messana. His abandoned land armies, leaderless and demoralized, quickly surrendered. Before more of his inner circle could defect, Sextus abandoned Sicily entirely, sailing with his family in secret to the east. He hoped that Antony, whose mother he had once given sanctuary, would grant him mercy. The surrendered Pompeian legions, now leaderless, were quickly besieged in Messana by the armies of Lepidus and Agrippa. They sent envoys to negotiate a surrender. Agrippa, on Octavian's orders, refused to concede anything until Octavian himself arrived. But Lepidus had other plans. He accepted their surrender and, in a shocking move, incorporated all 8 of the Pompeian legions into his own army. In return, he granted them the right to sack the wealthy city of Messana. Combined with his own forces from Africa, Lepidus now had a total of 22 legions under his personal command, an army roughly equal to Octavian's. He now chose to make his move. He declared himself the conqueror of Sicily. He sent word to the other towns on the island to reject any envoys from Octavian. He then sent a message to Octavian with his demands a complete restoration of the original division of the triumvirate. He would keep Africa and Sicily, and Octavian could have the rest. It was a direct challenge for control of the Western Empire. Octavian, of course, refused. The soldiers on both sides grew nervous. They had just won a great victory together, and now their commanders were on the verge of plunging them into another civil war. Octavian sensed this unease and decided on an act of incredible, reckless bravery. He sent agents into Lepidus's camp to gauge the loyalty of the legions. Then, leaving his main guard at the gate, he rode into the camp himself, virtually alone. He knew that many of the ex-Pompeian legions were worried that their surrender terms would be invalid without his approval. He knew that Lepidus's original legions were embittered at having to share the spoils of Messana with their former enemies. He rode through the camp, proclaiming that he would accept all who wanted to join him. Many pledged their loyalty on the spot. Lepidus, hearing that his army was dissolving around him, stormed out of his tent. A scuffle broke out. One of Octavian's entourage was killed. Octavian himself was almost wounded. He retreated to his cavalry at the gate, and then, with only his bodyguard, charged back into the camp. More and more of Lepidus's legions, seeing their commander's weakness and swayed by the power of Caesar's name, defected. The trickle became a flood. Lepidus, his army gone, his authority evaporated, was left alone and powerless. He was forced to come to Octavian's camp and beg for his life. In a final, humiliating scene, the triumvir, a man who had once ruled a third of the world, threw himself at the feet of the young Caesar. Octavian stripped him of all his powers. His life, however, was spared. Lepidus, often dismissed by history as an incompetent fool, had played the game of power and lost. But unlike almost every other major player in the Roman civil wars, he had managed to survive. He would live to the ripe old age of 76, a forgotten but living relic of a dead era, with the fall of Lepidus and the flight of Sextus. The invasion of Sicily was over. Octavian, through a combination of Agrippa's genius and his own tenacity and political cunning, was now the sole master of the West. Sextus, the last son of Pompey the Great, was eventually hunted down in Asia Minor and executed, some say on Antony's orders. The last remnants of the Pompeian faction were finally crushed. For more than a decade, the Roman world had been torn apart by a complex, multi-sided conflict. Now, all the other players had been swept from the board. Only 2 remained, Antony in the east and Octavian in the west. All the common enemies that had held their fragile alliance together were gone. They now stood alone, 2 titans on opposite sides of the sea, with an entire world as the prize. The final war was no longer a matter of if, but when.